Hey there, you're about to watch this compilation of hand-drawn and animated history videos we made. If you want to watch our newest videos right when they come out, be sure to subscribe to our main channel, Serious History. Alright, let me get the lights for you.
Today we're going over the most epic comeback stories in history. Alfred the Great. It's April 871, and the island of Britain has been transformed into a war zone. Though small Viking parties had raided the coast of Britain for decades, this time it was much different. 6 years ago, hundreds of Viking ships made landfall in East Anglia, and the great heathen army with numbers in the thousands set foot on British soil. With their wives, children, and toolmakers, this army had no interest in simple looting. This time, they were here as conquerors. The Vikings were ruthless warriors, and within 2 years, the once mighty English kingdoms of Northumbria and East Anglia had fallen into their control. In 871, the heathen army finally turns its attention to the kingdom of Wessex, and King Ethelred and his brother Alfred lead their army into battle against the Viking invaders. The two forces engage in 9 brutal battles over the span of a year, and momentum swings back and forth like a championship fight. But soon, more Viking reinforcements arrive in Britain, and their numbers are simply too much for Ethelred's army of conscripted farmers and merchants. In the Battle of Merton, the king is wounded and he soon dies of his injuries. The 22-year-old Alfred mourns the loss of his fourth and final brother. He never wanted to be king. He had plans for a quiet life filled with reading and learning about the wonders of the world. But now he was the only one left, and the grim responsibility for leading his people against the greatest threat his kingdom had ever faced was thrust onto his shoulders. As Alfred was preparing for his brother's funeral, the Vikings attacked again, destroying what was left of his already battered army. With no other options, Alfred pays the Vikings to leave. The great heathen army takes the treasure and goes on to attack the neighboring kingdom of Mercia. They are unstoppable, and by 875, Alfred's kingdom of Wessex is the last remaining English kingdom free of Viking rule. With the complete conquest of the island looking like an inevitability, more Danes pour into Britain, and the Viking army in the south, led by a monstrous man named Guthrum, sees an opportunity to snuff out the last pocket of English independence. He assembles his men and marches towards Wessex. Now, Alfred was in a really bad situation when he paid off the Vikings the last time, but he didn't waste the time he had bought and had fully rebuilt his army. He was ready for them, and while the Vikings are looting the town of Wareham, he traps them in the city. As hard as Alfred tries to force them out, the Vikings prove to be pretty good at withstanding sieges, and eventually Alfred turns to diplomacy instead. Okay, now I want you guys to pinky swear on that ring you got there that you said was for your god, Thor, right? Okay, swear on that ring that you'll give back the hostages and leave us alone. Great, alright, I'll be right back to get those hostages. See guys, I told you, just a little bit of charm goes a long way. But they pinky swore to Thor. Guthrum had no issues breaking oaths and treaties he made, even one sworn to one of his Norse gods. And as soon as Alfred left, he killed all of their hostages and ran off to Exeter to wait for reinforcements. Alfred moved to the coast and blocked said reinforcements from landing, and soon the Viking ships were all wrecked offshore in a storm. With no backup, Guthrum and his warriors retreated back to Mercia. Though Alfred is on high alert, there are no sightings of the Vikings in Wessex for an entire year, and eventually he comes to believe he had won the war. He had defended his kingdom from the invaders and brought peace to his land. So, in January of 878, to celebrate the victory against the heathen invaders, Alfred hosts a Christmas feast in Chippenham, away from his fortified capital, and invites lords and nobles, his best soldiers, and clergymen to come and celebrate the birth of their savior and the newfound peace in Wessex. Little did they know, this was exactly what Guthrum was waiting for. As Alfred and his men are toasting, a loud rumbling begins to swell outside the hall. The king and his guests try to see what the commotion is when suddenly, large Viking warriors burst through the doorways and begin slaughtering everyone within reach. They had learned that Christmas was a religious day for the Saxons and realized that this would be the perfect time to strike. Alfred and his soldiers are unarmed for the holy celebration, and the Vikings mercilessly tear through the dinner guests. In the chaos, the king and a small band of bodyguards flee into the marsh, while the remaining dinner guests scream in agony as they are massacred. Alfred runs until he reaches Somerset, Exhausted and dirty, he is taken in by an old peasant woman who feels sorry for this desperate man. She has no idea he is her king, and she asks him to watch some of her cakes she had put near the fire to bake. Alfred agrees, but as he stares into the fire, his mind races between thoughts of self-pity and desperation to save his kingdom. 7 years I held them, bought them with gold when I had to, fought the best I could. One bloody night, that's all it took! One night and the 7 years were all for nothing! I could still hear them screaming. My people, my household guard, they died so I could run. Loyal men, good men, died defending a king who abandoned them. What kind of king runs while his warriors die? What kind of king watches cakes by a fire? Oh no. I told you not to burn the cakes! As the king sat there being chewed out by that old peasant woman, it's hard to imagine why he didn't just give up then and there. Most would. Heck, the king of Mercia fled to Rome when the Vikings came for him. But Alfred was different. He apologizes to the woman for her cakes and leaves with a calm intensity. Maybe it was because he was deeply religious and he believes God was testing him like many great kings in the past. Or maybe it was just because he wanted revenge for Guthrum ruining his Christmas dinner. Whatever the reason, after months spent reviewing all of his options, Alfred decides to lay it all on the line and to try to fight back one last time against the Vikings. He sends out a call to every able-bodied man to take up their sword and join him to fight against these invaders. He calls on them to rally at Egbert's Stone on the 7th week after Easter, and together they will fight, not as kings, nobles, farmers, or merchants, but instead they will fight together as English. But was there anyone left to hear his call to arms? The Vikings had killed his best soldiers at the Christmas attack. Many nobles expecting the fall of Wessex had turned on their king or fled the island altogether. Well aware that he may be marching to not just his own death, but the death of his kingdom, Alfred prepares what's left of his decimated army and rides for Egbert's Stone. As he approaches the rendezvous point, his worst fears begin to race through his mind. What if no one is there? What if his message never reached his people? Or even worse, what if they had lost faith in their king? But as Alfred crests the final hill that overlooks Egbert's Stone, he is welcomed with the roar of 4,000 men. Their swords raised, they cheer their king as he rides towards them. They had all heard his call and were all prepared to fight to defend their homeland. Alfred leads this army to confront Guthrum at the Battle of Edington. Leading from the front lines, Alfred and his men engage the Vikings in brutal melee combat for hours, until finally they break the will of the great heathen army. Guthrum and his remaining men flee the battle, with Alfred and his men cutting down anyone they could catch. The Vikings eventually make it to Chippenham, the same town that they had attacked Alfred during his Christmas feast. Alfred sieges the town for weeks, starving the Vikings, until Guthrum finally surrenders. The warlord expects the king to execute his entire army, but instead, Alfred does something no one could have ever imagined in 1,000 years. He tells the Vikings that if they wish to surrender, he will allow it. But first, Guthrum must be baptized and convert to Christianity. Then all Vikings must leave Wessex and never return. Guthrum, thinking that this option is much better than being turned into a blood eagle, agrees and is baptized. Alfred actually becomes his godfather, and after being treated like family for a few weeks, the reformed warlord takes his Viking army and goes back to East Anglia. Now, Alfred had already been fooled by Guthrum multiple times, who had shown no respect for any religion, including his own Norse one. So to most people, it probably seemed like he would just do the same thing again. But perhaps the most surprising thing about this story is that for some reason, it seems like the Viking warlord actually takes his religious conversion seriously. He begins using his Christian name and never attacks Alfred or Wessex again. He ruled his kingdom known as the Danelaw until his death as a peaceful king. As for Alfred, his comeback story against the Vikings alone would have made him a legend in itself. But he goes on to do so much more. He completely reforms his kingdom's military, making it more powerful than ever. He creates the first English navy and finally led a cultural renaissance, translating texts from Latin to English. He spends his days dreaming of a day when there were no borders separating the kingdoms of the land, a day when all the English are united as one. And when he retakes London from the Vikings in 886, he does so not as the king of Wessex, but as the king of the Anglo-Saxons. His son would inherit the now powerful kingdom that he had saved from the brink of annihilation, and eventually his grandson would conquer the last Viking kingdom on the island and become the first king of England. For all the things he accomplished in his relatively short life, Alfred is the only English king to ever be given the title, the Great. Sundiata Keita. It's the turn of the 13th century, and in a small corner of the once great empire of Ghana lies a tiny kingdom called Kangaba, which is ruled by a king named Magan. Though his kingdom is small, his people love him, and he is a fair and just ruler. The citizens of Kangaba feel fortunate to live here, as they have heard horror stories from other lands throughout the now fallen empire. Most notably, stories of a tyrant king named Sumaro, who has seized control of the Sasso region where he rules through fear and violence. But Kangaba is far from Sasso, and the king and his people live a peaceful life. But little did they know that their tiny kingdom was destined to give birth to one of the greatest kings in the history of Africa. One day, Magan is sitting under a tree with his advisors when a hunter from a foreign land approaches with a gift, a thank you for allowing him to hunt in his peaceful lands. The king accepts the gift and learns the hunter is from the land of Sangaran. The hunters of Sangaran are said to be soothsayers, powerful mystics who can see the future, and he asks this hunter to tell him what God has in store for him. The hunter agrees and produces shells from his satchel that he will use to peer into the king's future. Staring intensely at the shells, the hunter moves them around. He looks up at the king and says, "Your successor is not yet born." What do you mean?" asks the king. "He has a fine son birthed from a beautiful woman named Sasuma." But the hunter shakes his head and continues, "2 hunters will one day bring a woman from far away to you. She will be hideous, the ugliest woman you have ever seen, with eyes that look to be laid on her face and a huge hump on her back." Right. I think I'll stick with She will be so ugly, people will call her the Buffalo Woman. But you must marry her, for she will be the mother of him, the mightiest king, who will be a lion so great that this land will be known forever. Alright. A few days later, 2 hunters do arrive and bring with them a woman that they offer to the king as a gift. She is by far the ugliest woman he has ever seen, and so he marries her because, prophecy and stuff. The woman is named Sogolon, and soon she becomes pregnant and gives birth to a boy. He is given the name Sundiata, and the king is excited. The Lion King, his true successor, has been born. But the excitement soon turns into disappointment as the child grows and it becomes obvious he is disabled. He never learns to walk, and at the age of 3 is still crawling around, dragging his legs behind him. The king's previous wife, Sasuma, sees this and laughs. She brings her son near Sogolon and says, "Come, my son, walk, jump, leap about." And as her son pranced in front of Sundiata, she says, "I prefer a son who walks on his 2 legs to a lion that crawls on the ground," and walks away cackling with her son jumping after her. Sogolon tries everything to heal her son's legs. She researches and tries every herb she can find, but nothing works, and the king is growing more and more disappointed by the day. Maybe Sundiata was not to be the future king. So, he tried to make more children with Sogolon. She becomes pregnant again, but the king is disappointed when she gives birth to a daughter, one who is just as ugly as she is. She gets pregnant again and gives birth to another boy, but when he checks with his spiritual guides, they tell him this child will be the right hand of the king of prophecy, not the king himself. The king doesn't know what to do. He trusts the prophecy, but it seems so wrong. When Sundiata turns 7, he is still not walking, and the king is nearing death. Still believing in the prophecy given to him by the hunter, his last words are to hand his kingdom to Sundiata, but his advisors refuse. A disabled child as their king? They would appear weak and would surely be conquered by a neighboring kingdom. So they give the throne to the son of Sasuma instead. The next day, Sogolon stares at her son, lying on his stomach, eating from a bowl on the ground like an animal. She had done everything she could for him, but the prophecy was wrong. She can no longer hold back her tears and breaks down and cries. Sundiata finishes his meal and looks to his mother. "Do not cry," he says. I will show you today that I can walk." He crawls to the village blacksmith and asks him to give him an iron rod. In front of a crowd, Sundiata grabs the rod and while laying on the ground, stands it up vertically. He then slowly uses the bar to pull himself up. He strains every muscle in his body, but slowly he rises to a knee. The bar bends, and with sweat streaming down his face, Sunjata pushes himself up off the ground. He releases the iron rod from his grasp and stands for the first time on his own 2 feet. The crowd erupts into cheers. "The lion walks!" they shout. From here, Sunjata quickly grows stronger and stronger, and soon the people in the kingdom begin to believe in the prophecy again. Maybe he actually is the Lion King. And all of this enrages Sushumna, and she begins to plot to have Sunjata assassinated to protect her son's place as king. Fearing for her child's life, Sogolon takes Sunjata, and together they flee the village in the still of the night. They wander for 7 years, bouncing from kingdom to kingdom. The hardships make Sunjata stronger, and he eventually finds his way to the kingdom of Mema. By this time, Sunjata had grown to be a powerful man. He joins their army, and when he fights in a war with the Mema king, his bravery on the battlefield is noticed, and he deems Sunjata worthy of the Mema throne. But Sogolon, now sick and on her deathbed, reminds her son that his destiny is not here in Mema, but back in their home village. One day, merchants from Sunjata's homeland arrive. They are brought to Sunjata, and when they see him, they fall to their knees and begin to cry. "We have left our home 2 months ago, disguised as merchants, but in reality we have been searching for you. The tyrant Sumaro has invaded our home. Our king and his mother have fled and left us all alone. We continue to fight, but we have no leader. The soothsayers have told us that only the son of Sogolon can save us, and we are now saved because we have finally found you. Sunjata, our Lion King, your father's throne awaits you." Upon hearing this, Sunjata thinks of his mother. She had died, hoping the prophecy would one day come true. He gathers the army in Mema and visits all of the small kingdoms he had visited after leaving his home. He tells these kings of Sumaro and how if they desire their freedom, they must unite to defeat him once and for all. His army becomes larger and larger with each stop, and he leads this unified force in the Battle of Karina, where Sumaro and his forces are defeated. Following the battle, the kings who had joined Sunjata kneel down before him and give him the title of Mansa, the King of Kings. This new land he will rule will come to be known as Mali, a glorious empire with vast gold mines and salt beds that becomes one of the richest empires in the history of the world. One that would become so wealthy that Sunjata's descendant, Mansa Musa, is still regarded today as the richest person to have ever walked the earth.
Today, we're going over what I think is the greatest comeback in human history. The year is 602 CE, and Emperor Maurice of the Eastern Roman Empire is in a bit of a pickle. See, a few weeks ago, his army had finally won a massive victory against some Slavic invaders, and after years of brutal fighting, the Roman soldiers were excited to return home to rest and celebrate the win. But Maurice, he had other plans. He thought it would be better, and cheaper, if the army stayed up there in the Balkans over the winter instead of coming home, and the troops did not like that idea one bit. They marched back to Constantinople, and under the orders of an officer named Phocas, take control of the capital city. Phocas then brutally murders the emperor's sons and kills Maurice himself. With no one of royal lineage left alive, he declares himself the new emperor. Phocas then proceeds to speedrun his way to becoming one of the worst rulers the Romans had ever seen. His people live in fear, and anyone who questions his authority is tortured and executed. Now, Phocas's coup actually went fairly smoothly, as far as coups go, I guess, but he made one major miscalculation. A decade earlier, Maurice had helped the Sassanid Persian king Khosrow II regain his throne after he was overthrown by one of his generals. And through this act, Emperor Maurice and Khosrow had actually become friends. This strange friendship ended the bitter rivalry between the Byzantines and Persians and brought peace and stability to the region for the first time in centuries. But when Khosrow hears that Maurice has been murdered, he thinks that maybe he doesn't want to honor the peace deal with the guy who just killed his friend. He announces he's going to avenge his bro Maurice and begins an invasion into Roman lands, instantly reigniting the dormant war between the Byzantines and the Persians. He places his army under the command of his most skilled general, Sharbaraz, who quickly begins to wreak havoc in the easternmost Byzantine cities. In response, Phocas prepares to defend his lands, but he quickly proves himself a terrible leader. his troops lose battle after battle, and by 608 CE, just a few years after he took the throne, the empire is completely falling apart. A large chunk of the Balkans to the north had been captured by the Slavs, and Mesopotamia and much of Syria had fallen to Sharbaraz and the Persians. The Romans are on the ropes and on the verge of being completely snuffed out from history. They begin to pray for a miracle, a hero to save them, and this savior comes from the most unexpected of places. In October 610 CE, a rebel army from the northern African provinces began their march to Constantinople. They're led by a man named Heraclius, the son of the governor of Carthage. He'd had enough of watching Phocas f*** up the empire, and he believes he has what it takes to save it. When he arrives at the capital city, he's shocked to see the condition of its people. The once proud Romans are starving and filled with fear. Upon seeing Heraclius, the imperial guard, run by Phocas's own brother-in-law, bring the emperor kicking and screaming to the rebel army. Heraclius is so appalled at the lack of loyalty among Phocas's men that he asks, "Is this how you have ruled the empire?" Phocas stares back in contempt and says, "And will you rule it any better?"
Oh, shit. Really going at me.
With Phocas gone, the church crowns Heraclius the new emperor, and he immediately sets out to make peace with the Sassanid Persians. He's pretty hopeful since he's removed Maurice's murderer and all, but unfortunately for him, after taking so much Byzantine land, Khosrow had pretty much forgotten about avenging his friend and now just wants to rule the entire area. Khosrow refuses to call off his invasion, and Heraclius is forced to fight to defend what's left of the empire. He chooses to personally lead his army into battle, the first emperor to fight on the front lines in over 2 centuries. His advisors are completely against the idea. But to Heraclius, all the Byzantine generals have been doing a shit job against the Persians, so he has no choice and has to do it himself. He leads nearly the entire Roman army to the city of Antioch in 613 CE and faces off against the Persian forces under the command of General Sharbaraz. Heraclius knows that this is his shot. Win here, and he'll prove to everyone that he really is the hero that they were praying for. He'll restore the Roman Empire to glory and drive off the Persians for good. Confidently, he strides into battle and he loses terribly. It's not even close. His troops are routed, Antioch is brutally looted, and Heraclius barely escapes alive. His gamble of bringing almost his entire army into battle ends in complete disaster. He loses a ton of men, and the Persians are one step closer to wiping out the once mighty Roman Empire. Heraclius retreats to Constantinople in a panic, while Sharbaraz continues to take more and more land. The Persians overrun Damascus just a few months after Antioch, slaying and enslaving Christian civilians by the thousands. The following year, they take Jerusalem with almost no resistance. Sharbaraz sets the Church of the Holy Sepulchre ablaze and takes the true cross, the most holy relic in Christianity, back to Khosrow as a gift. In Constantinople, the people hear the news from Jerusalem and begin to fear that this was a sign that God had deserted them. Sensing weakness, the Slavs in the north completely overrun the Byzantine territory in the Balkans. The Goths also see their opportunity to seize Spain, and the following year, Sharbaraz fights his way back to Chalcedon and takes the city. The Persians are now right outside the gates of Constantinople, and not knowing what to do, Heraclius begins praying to God for an answer. When he had left Carthage, he was convinced it was his destiny to restore the empire, to defeat the Persians, but in the end, he wasn't good enough. He had tried, and he had failed. At this low point, Heraclius begins to think over all of his options. Maybe he could offer whatever's left of the empire to the Persians and become a vassal state. But as these thoughts are going through his mind, he receives a letter from Khosrow, and it's the ultimate diss track of the era. In this letter, the Persian king is really rubbing it in, talking about all the losses Heraclius had suffered and how it's only a matter of time before he comes for him. This makes Heraclius feel even worse, and he considers running away from it all and moving the capital city from Constantinople to Carthage. He even begins loading ships to abandon the city, but is stopped by the Patriarch of Constantinople, who was kind of like the Pope of the Eastern Church. He brings Heraclius to the Hagia Sophia, and in this most holiest of places, makes him swear an oath that he will never abandon the city. The Patriarch says he believes in Heraclius, and that God has not abandoned them. He then says that he'll give him whatever he needs, all of the church's riches to fund his army to fight back. The words of the patriarch move Heraclius. He thinks back to great emperors like Justinian and Constantine, who rose to the occasion to save the empire when it was in its greatest danger. The emperor's duty is to defend his people until his last breath. Even when the odds are stacked against him, he cannot run away. And almost on command, the universe seems to bend to Heraclius' newfound resolve. Sharbaraz pulls his army back and turns his attention to Egypt. For the next several years, as if forgetting the plot, the Persians forget Constantinople and instead methodically seize the Egyptian province town by town. And this gives Heraclius just enough breathing room to start planning his comeback. The damage done by the Persians in this war has been catastrophic. The empire that once stretched from Spain to the edge of Turkey has been reduced to just a strip of land around Constantinople. But with the church and his people behind him, it is now or never. Defending themselves have only allowed the Persians to push them further and further back. They have nothing left to give up. So Heraclius decides to switch his strategy from defense to offense. If the time of the Romans is to end, it will end on their terms. They will die on their swords. He melts down any precious metal he can find in the city to fund the war, and soon every citizen becomes involved in the war effort. They all understand how serious it is, and that they're all fighting for their survival. As Sharbaraz takes Alexandria and marches down the Nile, working to cut off the food supply from Constantinople, Heraclius carefully studies Maurice's Strategicon, the manual of war and strategy written by the former emperor, and he and his men train relentlessly, day by day transforming into a well-honed fighting machine. Their numbers are small, just enough soldiers to form one last Roman legion, but they've found strength in their emperor's leadership. He tells them that they're the last defenders of Rome, and upon hearing this, they vow to fight with him to the end. Finally, 9 years after the humiliating defeat at Antioch, Heraclius makes his move. On April 4th, 622 CE, he leaves Constantinople. He turns and looks back at the city walls, realizing this may be the last time he ever sees them. He takes a deep breath, and then, holding up an icon of Christ for his soldiers to see, they set out to regain his empire or die trying. His legion is well trained, but they have no replacements or reinforcements. If he loses a single battle, it'll be the end of the Romans. He must be flawless. The fate of the empire rests on his shoulders. He marches into Anatolia, and he leads his legion into an epic battle with the army of Sharbaraz. Heraclius commands his men from the front lines, and together they fight with everything they've got. Sharbaraz is caught off guard by the dramatic improvement of the Roman troops. He loses the battle and is forced to retreat. Having finally achieved his first victory against the Persians, Heraclius quickly pushes onward. He marches on to the small town of Ganzak, where he's surprised to go head-to-head against Khosrow II himself. The Persian king had decided to personally lead an army to battle. The Persians have never controlled this much land or been this wealthy. If he can beat Heraclius here, he can keep everything they've taken and be remembered as the greatest Persian king of all time. But Heraclius will not be denied, and he smashes Khosrow's army, forcing him to retreat. After the battle, Heraclius visits one of the 3 great Zoroastrian fire temples, which was located nearby. As revenge for Jerusalem, he orders it destroyed. The Romans celebrate around the burning temple. The underdogs are fighting back. From that point on, Heraclius seems unable to lose. In February 625 CE, he launches a night raid on Sharbaraz's camp, and the general, who was naked at the time, barely escapes. At the Sarus River, when Sharbaraz's troops try to prevent the Romans from crossing the bridge, Heraclius personally leads the charge. The Romans storm the bridge, routing the Persians, who are caught off guard by soldiers willing to charge headfirst toward their firing archers. Under Heraclius' command, his men fight as if unafraid of death itself. However, danger lurks closer to home. Sharbaraz manages to slip his army into Chalcedon, just outside Constantinople. They've coordinated with the Slavs to the north, who have assembled an army to attack the city from the other direction. And soon, Constantinople finds itself surrounded by 80,000 hostile troops, with Heraclius and his legion far away from home, deep in Persian territory. Heraclius is torn. He's made huge progress, but if he were to rush back to the capital, he would give back all of his gains to Khosrow. If he doesn't return, Constantinople could fall, and that would be the end of the empire itself. After deep reflection, he decides to press on into Persian territory, continuing his offense, leaving the capital in the hands of the defenders there. If their city is truly the city of God, he will protect its walls and they will not fall. The Slavs, along with their Avar allies, begin their attack in 626, and the city is sieged for a month, but through each assault, the walls hold. People in the city begin to believe that they are truly being protected by the hand of God, and the defenders of the city fight back fiercely. By August, both the Slavs and the Persians have suffered enormous casualties and give up. The Romans celebrate on the streets, parading the image of the Virgin Mary, thanking her for her protection. It was at this point that Khosrow, frustrated by the string of recent failures, does what all horrible bosses do and starts blaming his failures on his team. He writes a letter ordering the execution of Sharbaraz. His trusted general has been losing too many battles, and he wants him gone. Now, just losing Sharbaraz would have dealt a huge blow to the Persian cause, but it gets way worse for Khosrow. See, Heraclius intercepts this letter, and instead of simply using the information to his advantage, he adds the names of 400 Persian officers to the list, and then delivers the letter to Sharbaraz. When the Persian general reads the orders, his face darkens in anger. He and his army had fought for their king for almost a decade, and this is their reward? He gathers his men and informs them of Khosrow's treachery, and together they collectively decide to leave the war. Suddenly, the Persian king had lost not only his best general, but his largest army as well. Against all odds, Heraclius finds himself a battle away from pulling off the greatest comeback in history. But time is running short, as winter is quickly approaching. Fighting into winter may risk his men starving to death. The smart move would be to pull back, recharge, and wait until spring to fight again. His soldiers are exhausted after months of intense fighting, but the Persians are the weakest they've ever been. They're barely hanging on, and now the Romans actually outnumber them. They could end this war once and for all with a single decisive battle, but is there enough time on the clock? Play it safe and risk giving the Persians time to regroup, or risk everything now and try to deliver the knockout blow? Heraclius sits alone in his tent, trying to make a decision that could determine the fate of his empire. Within a day, he makes up his mind. He'll risk it all for the chance to take out Khosrow here and now. And so, as winter begins to chill the land, the Romans continue to push into Persian territory. And on December 12, 627 CE, Heraclius draws the Persians into a trap by feigning a retreat near the ruins of Nineveh. The Persians chase after the Romans, and on command, the Romans turn on them and brutal hand-to-hand combat begins. The Romans begin to gain the upper hand, and sensing this, the Persian general Razad calls out to Heraclius, challenging him to solo combat in the middle of the battlefield. If he's able to kill the emperor, the Persians would be the ultimate winners of the near decade-long war. Heraclius steps forward, unafraid, and accepts the challenge. The two generals charge at each other, and Heraclius defeats Razad with a single blow. Two more warriors quickly challenge the emperor, but he cuts them down as well. Without their commander, the Persian troops panic and begin to flee, and the Romans rout and cut down 6,000 Persian soldiers who attempt to run away. The Persian army is now nearly completely decimated, and Heraclius pushes closer and closer to Khosrow. He travels to Dastagird, right outside the Persian capital, and burns down Khosrow's summer palace. Then he offers peace to the Persians, proposing that his empire be fully restored. But despite the near annihilation of his forces, Khosrow rejects this peace. He had fought too hard and for too long to give up all he had gained, and this turns out to be the last decision as king he will ever make. His son Kavad II leads a coup against him, backed by nearly the entire Persian nobility. They understand that there's no use continuing to fight against Heraclius and his army, and Khosrow is unceremoniously executed by his own son. Kavad II quickly accepts Heraclius' offer, and he returns all the land his father had taken: Palestine, Syria, Mesopotamia, and in the blink of an eye, the Eastern Roman Empire is restored to its former glory. Kavad II also returns the True Cross, signaling the end of the centuries-long conflict. The Sassanid Empire quickly falls into a civil war and begins to destroy itself from the inside out. Heraclius and his men return to Constantinople, and as they enter the city, the people erupt into celebration. His subjects line the streets with tears in their eyes and bow down to the man who has saved them all. They gaze as Heraclius and his men carry the True Cross to the Hagia Sophia, where they affix it to its roof as proof of their triumph over the Sassanid Empire. For weeks, the people of Constantinople celebrate the return of their hero, their emperor, Heraclius. Heraclius later travels to Jerusalem and personally returns the true cross to its rightful home, a moment that should have been a glorious final chapter in the story of a hero. And in fact, had Heraclius passed away right then and there, he would forever have been remembered as one of the greatest Roman generals of all time. His name would be included with the likes of Julius Caesar and Scipio. But fate had a different plan, and he lived on, and in a few short years his legacy would be forever tarnished. See, his total victory over the Sassanid Persians had opened the door for a new, much more powerful foe to emerge in the region. In the vacuum caused by the collapse of the Zoroastrian Sassanid Empire, a prophet named Muhammad would quickly build a following, and his teachings would bring about not just a new empire, but a new religion that would ultimately bring Constantinople to its knees and claim much of the empire Heraclius had fought so hard to restore. Today, we're going over one of the most epic redemption stories in history. It's 1292, and the Kingdom of Scotland is on the verge of an all-out civil war. 6 years earlier, the good King Alexander III died with no children of his own, and his only legitimate heir dies before she can be crowned. With no clear successor, 13 Scottish nobles laid their claim for the throne. The field is whittled down to two finalists, a man named John Balliol and Robert de Bruce, also known as Robert the Competitor, both of whom were descendants of the great Scottish King David I. Not trusting each other, they asked the King of England, Edward Longshanks, to come to Scotland to help decide who should rule. Though Edward was a terrifying man who had led a brutal conquest of Wales just a few years earlier, he had more or less been friendly to Scotland, and the nobles felt they could trust his judgment. But old Eddie Longshanks had secretly been waiting for this exact opportunity. We are live for the finale of Who Wants to Be the King of Scotland, and in just a few moments, we'll finally know who will be crowned as our king. Coming to the stage, not to be confused with his son or grandson with the exact same name, Robert the Bruce. Judge number 1, King Edward, your question please. If you are made King of Scotland, would you swear your loyalty to me? No, of course not. Scotland must be ruled by Scots. Good answer. John Balliol, same question. Maybe, I guess. John Balliol is King of Scotland. Wait, what? See, Edward had always wanted Scotland, but Alexander was a good king who was loved by his people. If he'd attempted an invasion earlier, the Scots would have fought tooth and nail to defend their home. But a new king, especially a weak one like John Balliol, could easily be made into a puppet. And that's exactly what Edward set out to do. Balliol was initially pumped to be the king, but Longshanks does not treat him as an equal, and time again, the new Scottish monarch is humiliated in front of his people. Eventually, King Edward demands a draft of local Scotsmen to help him in his war against the French. Balliol realizes that complying would fully admit that Scotland was nothing but a vassal state to England. With nothing left to lose, Balliol does the unthinkable and requests help from the King of France to stand up to King Edward. Word of this alliance reaches Longshanks and he's enraged. A vassal state allying with his greatest enemy could simply not go unpunished, and so he readies his army and begins plans for an invasion into Scotland. John Balliol frantically calls upon his nobles to raise their armies to defend the homeland, but the Bruce family rejects his call. See, the Bruces were all still salty about not being the King of Scotland, and they refused to accept Balliol as their legitimate king. In response, Balliol and his supporters, mainly the Cummins clan, confiscate their lands and later attack the Bruces while they're sheltering in England as revenge for their betrayal. King Edward begins his invasion in 1296, and the Scottish armies can do little to stop him. Longshanks is ruthless, and in March, he storms his army into the town of Berwick and slaughters 17,000 civilians. The following month, his mounted knights go toe-to-toe with the best Scotland has to offer at the Battle of Dunbar, and it's another blowout. Over 100 Scottish knights and nobles are captured, and soon John Balliol is forced to surrender. In a public humiliation ceremony, King Edward rips Balliol's royal garments and leaves him standing naked in front of the crowd. He then steals the sacred Stone of Destiny from Scone that had been used to crown Scottish kings for centuries. Edward officially declares Scotland a province of England and returns home with the Stone of Destiny and his prisoners. With the war for independence seemingly lost, 1,500 Scottish nobles pledged their loyalty to King Edward, and amongst them is the youngest Robert the Bruce, the grandson of Robert the Competitor. Though he shared the same name as his father and grandfather, this Robert was different. Since he was a child, he had drunk the Kool-Aid that the Bruces were the rightful kings of Scotland. He was initially okay sitting and waiting for Edward to make him a vassal king, but soon he grew impatient, and in 1297 he and some other nobles led a revolt against King Edward. But before a single battle, they sign a treaty and he joins the English again. Later that year, a minor noble named William Wallace raises an army of peasants and pulls off an upset victory against the English at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Robert the Bruce sees this as his path to the throne of a renewed independent Scotland, and he switches sides back to the Scottish resistance. But less than a year later, Wallace is soundly defeated by Edward Longshanks at the Battle of Falkirk. Robert the Bruce has made Wallace's successor as one of the guardians of Scotland to lead the resistance, but in a few years, he gives up again, and he slinks back to the English side in 1302. In the span of just 5 years, Robert had flip-flopped 4 times and had pretty much lost the trust of most people in Scotland. His rival John Comyn becomes the face of the Scottish resistance and most likely person to be made king. Despite nothing really going his way and technically being on Team Longshanks again, Robert the Bruce still delusionally believed that he will one day be the king of the Scots, and he secretly begins making alliances with other Scottish nobles. He even strikes a deal with his most hated rival, John Comyn. Little did he know that Comyn also wanted to be king, and he would not waste his opportunity to get rid of a potential rival for good. Comyn tells King Edward about Robert the Bruce's betrayal, and Longshanks immediately sends out orders to capture him. Robert gets word that his cover had been blown, and he takes off in the dark of the night back to Scotland. Enraged by the betrayal, Robert asks John Comyn to meet him at a church to discuss what happened. On February 10, 1306, the rivals for the Scottish throne meet in a chapel in Dumfries, and things get heated quick. "How could you? We had a deal!" screams Robert. His voice echoes throughout the holy building. The two men come to blows, and in the heat of the moment, Robert draws his sword and stabs Comyn, who falls to the ground in front of the altar. 2 of his men quickly rush in and finish the job. John Comyn was dead, and now there was no turning back. With what little support he had left in Scotland in attendance, and without the sacred stone of destiny, Robert the Bruce is crowned King of Scotland. At long last, his wish had finally come true, but he would soon learn, heavy is the head that wears the crown. For murdering someone in a church, he's excommunicated by the Pope, and within weeks, King Edward orders his forces in Scotland, led by the Earl of Pembroke, to fly the Dragon Banner, a clear warning that no quarter would be given to Robert and his men in battle. No prisoners would be taken, and the survivors would be executed. Robert the Bruce finds out about the kill-on-sight orders and travels to Perth to challenge the Earl to battle.
All right, Aymer, I'm here. Let's do this.
It's kind of late, bro. I'll come out and find you tomorrow. We can fight then.
Oh, okay. We're just going to, camp over there then. Come get us when you're ready.
Psych! We're ready now! Mounted cavalry rushes into Robert's camp, and they begin hacking his unarmed soldiers to pieces. The army of Robert the Bruce is caught completely off guard, and in the darkness, he scrambles to get his men prepared for battle. He mounts his steed and tries to fight, but he's knocked off and nearly captured 3 times before a small band of loyal men surround him and drag him away. The Earl of Pembroke makes good on the promise of the Dragon Banner, and nearly the entire Scottish army is killed or captured. Having lost everything, Robert the Bruce runs away with a handful of loyal soldiers to Rathlin Island off the coast of Ireland. Edward wants to send a clear message to the would-be king of the Scots, and soon he begins to hunt down Robert's entire family. 3 of his brothers are executed in brutal fashion. His wife is imprisoned, his 12-year-old daughter is captured and sent to a convent, and his sister is displayed like an animal in a cage hanging from a castle wall. On Rathlin, Robert wanders, lost and depressed. His whole life he had wanted the power, respect, and glory of a king, but now he was a king without a kingdom, an outlaw hiding on an island. He stumbles into a cave one day and slumps against the wall to wallow in self-pity. As he sits dejected, he watches a tiny spider try to spin its web. The creature crawls and attempts to jump from its ledge to the next, but it falls short and helplessly floats to the ground. Robert watches as the spider climbs back up to the same spot and tries again and again, but each time it falls short. Without realizing it, he soon finds himself cheering for the spider as it climbs back up the ledge for another try. The creature pauses for a brief moment, as if doubting itself as it stares at the ledge it had been trying so hard to reach.
Don't give up. Don't give up. You can do it. The spider launches itself with all its might and soars through the air. This time, it makes it across and quickly begins to spin its web. In that moment, Robert thinks of his own life. Like this spider, he too had his own dreams that he had chased and failed at many times. The only difference was that this spider never gave up. Inspired, Robert thinks that maybe he too could try again to achieve his dream, but this time to chase it differently. This time, he would be a real king, a man not simply given the crown, but one who becomes truly worthy of it. A king who shoulders the burden of his people and lights their darkest hour with hope. He leaves the cave a changed man, and in 1307, Robert the Bruce returns to Scotland. He doesn't have much, just 600 men make up his army, but he's determined to take back his kingdom. Being so heavily outnumbered, Robert adopts guerrilla tactics, hitting the English when they least expect it and running before they can mount a defense. At Loudon Hill, Robert sets a trap and lures the Earl of Pembroke and his army into battle. Despite being outnumbered, Robert and his tiny army emerge victorious, and he claims his first official victory over the English as King of the Scots. Edward hears that Robert the Bruce had returned and sets out to go to battle once again. But on his march north, he contracts dysentery and dies. His son, Edward II, is made King of England, but Junior was nowhere near the man Edward Longshanks was. He's indecisive and would rather have others make difficult decisions for him. Robert gets the news of King Edward's passing, and he realizes this is an opportunity he cannot waste. With his small band of freedom fighters, he relentlessly attacks and reclaims English-held castles, cities, and towns. Over the next 7 years, he works to regain the trust of the people of Scotland as he leads his men into battle again and again. Stories of his bravery spread throughout the land, and slowly his army of a few hundred freedom fighters grows into the thousands. By 1314, he had recaptured almost every single one of the English-held castles in Scotland. Things are now dire for Edward II, as one of his last castles in Scotland, Castle Stirling, capitulates to Robert's brother, and the English forces there agree to surrender if reinforcements do not arrive. Edward realizes he has to do something, so he raises an army of 15,000 men and rushes to Stirling. Robert the Bruce gets word of his movements and is concerned. Though his army had grown, he's still outnumbered over 2-1, and he has no heavy cavalry to counter the English war horses. Racing against the clock, he trains his pikemen to use their defensive schiltron formations offensively. It's the best he can do with so little time, and he drills them over and over again. He then scouts the road to the castle and chooses a location for the battle near a stream called the Bannockburn. To ensure the English fight him where he wants them, he sets traps that'll force Edward to engage him on his terms. And then he waits. On June 23, 1314, Robert the Bruce is patrolling the area on a scouting mission, and he watches as the first of the English heavy cavalry begin to emerge in the distance. Amongst the English army is a knight named Henry de Bohun, who spots Robert and instantly recognizes the outlaw king of the Scots. Without hesitation, de Bohun lowers his lance and charges at a full clip towards Robert the Bruce, looking to take him out here and now and claim all the glory of the battle. Robert sees the knight barreling straight at him, and instead of retreating, he draws his axe. The Scots watch in horror as their king takes off directly towards the advancing English knight. They can't bear to watch as the tip of de Bohun's lance gets closer and closer to their king. But at the last second, Robert maneuvers his horse and sidesteps the knight. He rises up on his stirrups and brings his axe crashing down onto the head of Henry de Bohun, splitting his skull in two. "Ha ha! Take that, you dirty—" "Oh no! You broke my favorite axe! Why'd you do that? God, seriously? This freaking sucks! Ugh!" The sight of their king effortlessly taking out an English knight fills his men with courage, and they bravely fight against the much larger English army. The will of the Scots is unshakable, and they inflict heavy casualties on the better-equipped English knights. Shocked, Edward's army pulls back and sets up camp for the night. Later that evening, a soldier from Edward's army defects and makes his way into Robert's camp. "Morale in the English army is low. If you fight them tomorrow, you can win." After nearly a decade of fighting what many thought was an unwinnable war, Robert the Bruce had led the Scots to the precipice of their freedom. Despite the good news, the Scottish king knows they were still massively outnumbered, and Edward's heavy cavalry would still be extremely dangerous. With the fate of his people hanging in the balance, he decides to let them have the final word. He turns to his war council and asks, "Shall we fight or not?" His generals shout back in unison, "Fight!" And so the following day, against an army more than twice their size, 6,000 Scotsmen bravely follow their king into battle to win their independence. Robert the Bruce sends his archers out to distract Edward's bowmen, and he quickly marches his pikemen out onto the field. The English knights see this and charge. As the rumbling of the mass of horses draws closer and closer, the Scots shout defiantly and raise their pikes. Wave after wave of English knights are impaled on their spears, and they continue to march forward. Robert sends his light cavalry, and they scatter Edward's archers, giving his schiltrons a clear path forward. Despite their superior numbers and weaponry, the English find themselves pushed back, and soon they're pinned against the Bannockburn stream. With Edward's army trapped, Robert deploys his reserves to deliver the final blow, and the English knights, realizing their king is now in danger, pull him from the battlefield. The English lose 5,000 men, including 1,000 knights and nobles, while Robert's army suffers fewer than 500 casualties. The victory at Bannockburn all but cemented Scottish independence, and after 8 years in captivity, Robert's wife, daughter, and sister are traded for hostages and freed. Robert the Bruce has his excommunication lifted by the Pope, and he's officially recognized by the Church as the true King of Scotland. Though the Pope had forgiven his sins, Robert the Bruce still wondered if he could ever truly be forgiven for the horrible act he had committed in the chapel decades ago. On his deathbed, he asks his good friend Sir James Douglas to take his heart to fight in a crusade so he can be sure his sins were absolved. Robert the Bruce dies just before his 55th birthday, and James Douglas makes good on his promise, wearing his king's heart in a silver casket around his neck while on a crusade to fight the Moors in Spain. While there, he and his fellow Scots are ambushed and find themselves severely outnumbered. As they prepare themselves for battle, Douglas tears Robert's heart from his neck and throws the casket at the advancing army and shouts, "Lead on, brave heart! I will follow thee!" Here are the most epic origin stories in history. Ashoka. It's the year 304 BC, and the Mauryan Empire is welcoming a new royal child. Lovingly held by his mother, he's given the name Ashoka, and the emperor, a man named Bindusara, stands near and gazes at this newborn. In this son, he sees a future of... not much, really. See, the emperor already has another son named Tsushima, born from another one of his wives, and he's actually his choice to become his heir. To add to this, Ashoka's mom was a commoner. Whoops! I mean, how did that happen? While Tsushima's was a noble. So yeah, case closed here. But Ashoka is still a royal son, and he's given a royal upbringing. Time passes, Ashoka grows up, and boy, he does look like he's turning out to be a huge disappointment. He's short, kind of fat, and is suffering some sort of weird skin condition which grosses his father out. Though he had already made up his mind that Tsushima was his guy, now he's certain. Ashoka is just way too ugly to be emperor. I mean, come on, look at him. But what Ashoka lacked in looks, he made up for in charisma and intelligence. And like most kids who know they're not the favorite, he grows to have a huge chip on his shoulder. He's schooled in all the things a royal son should learn, and once he's of age, his father begins to send him out to govern parts of his kingdom and to quell rebellions. Ashoka's first assignment was to govern the area of Ujjain, where he proved to be a master of governmental policy. And later, he was put in charge of quelling rebellions in Taxila, where he demonstrates a natural ability to command a military. It becomes obvious that Ashoka is talented enough to rule the empire, and this doesn't go unnoticed by the emperor's ministers. They try to tell the emperor, but their opinions don't really matter because Bindusara had already made up his mind. Tsushima was to be his heir. But in 273 BCE, the emperor falls ill and is quickly on his deathbed. Tsushima is off fighting a rebellion, so he sends for him to return home quickly so he can be crowned emperor. But by this point in time, the ministers have decided they like Ashoka way better. They think Tsushima is a spoiled brat, and they've watched Ashoka kill it, both governing and on the battlefield. So they lie to the emperor and say that Ashoka's sick and can't go, and that maybe he should just make Ashoka the emperor temporarily while he's waiting for Tsushima to return. The emperor's like, "Did I fucking stutter?" At which point, legend says Ashoka proclaims, "If the throne is rightfully mine, the gods will crown me as the next emperor." And just like that, Bindusara dies instantly and Ashoka is made emperor. How convenient. When Tsushima returns back to the capital, he's led by the ministers into a trap and falls into a pit of charcoal and dies an agonizing death. Ashoka then goes off and kills every single one of his other brothers, except one he kinda liked, to ensure he would have no competition. And so, in 268 BCE, Ashoka is crowned emperor, and he quickly proves all of his father's ministers were completely wrong, and becomes an unhinged tyrant who rules with fear and terror. His atrocities are too many to list, but here are some of his greatest hits. He once gave his ministers the impossible task to cut down every flowering or fruiting tree, and when they failed, he chopped off all their heads himself.
Oh my god, we should have totally gone with sushi.
This other time, while walking through a park with his concubines, he sees a beautiful Ashoka tree, which puts him in the mood for some afternoon delight. The concubines are so grossed out having to touch his gross skin that as soon as Ashoka fell asleep, they go and chop all the flowers off the tree to make sure it won't happen again, which I find hilarious. But when Ashoka wakes up and finds out what they did, he has them all burned to death. And perhaps his pièce de résistance, he constructed a beautiful palace, which he then fills with the most evil torture devices imaginable. Burning pits, fire chambers, molten metal for pouring down throats, spiked walls and ceilings for impaling, rotating blades for chopping off body parts, and iron hooks for hanging were all said to be found within the walls of this palace that's given the name Ashoka's Hell. No one who enters the palace ever comes out alive. It did evidently have a beautiful garden in front of it though. Now at this point you may be wondering, why are you even talking about this psychopath anyway? Well, it's because, believe it or not, he's often referred to today as Ashoka the Great, one of the greatest and most beloved rulers in the history of India, and his redemption arc begins in 262 BCE. Ashoka has dreams of surpassing his grandfather and father, who had successfully grown the Mauryan Empire to encompass nearly the entire Indian subcontinent, modern-day Afghanistan and Bangladesh. For his first conquest, he sets his sights on the kingdom of Kalinga, an unconquered area located on the eastern coast of India that his grandfather had once tried to take, but failed. The Kalinga were a proudly independent people who had wealth, trading ports, and a well-trained military, and defeating them would be a great first step to show he'd surpassed his forefathers. So, Ashoka takes an army of 600,000 infantry, 30,000 cavalry, and 9,000 war elephants and attacks Kalinga with the entire might of the Mauryan Empire. The Kalinga, though heavily outnumbered, refused to surrender and fight bravely to the end in a desperate but ultimately failed attempt to defend their homeland. The war does not last long, but is literal hell on earth, and the death and destruction are at levels unseen until World War II. The Mauryans win the war, but at a heavy cost, and when Ashoka goes to the battlefield to bask in his greatness, he's instead horrified by what he sees. The bodies of over 100,000 dead Kalinga soldiers litter the ground. Every step he takes is into a pool of festering blood. The stench of rotting flesh is unbearable, and the swarm of flies feasting on the corpses is deafening. He sees women, young and old, searching for their husbands, their fathers, and their children amongst the rotting bodies. Some are unlucky enough to find their loved ones, and their howling cries burn Ashoka's ears. He was not the first nor the last ruler to be confronted by the harsh realities of war. But in this moment, he's perhaps one of the few rulers in history who was filled with a deep sense of remorse. Was this the greatness he was seeking? Ashoka leaves the battlefield a changed man. He will no longer seek glory through war, and he invests himself wholly in the study of Buddhism. He begins to erect pillars throughout his kingdom with edicts on how he wishes for his people to live, peacefully with respect for one another, no matter their cultural or religious background. For the rest of his reign, he goes on no further conquest. His only goal was peace and the betterment of the lives of everyone living within his empire. He begins to use the empire's treasury to erect shelters for travelers, plant fruit-bearing trees along the main roads to feed the needy, and digs irrigation systems to provide clean water for everyone. Through his efforts, Maurya grows prosperous and enjoys peace that lasts for decades. He funds Buddhist missions out of India in an attempt to foster world peace, and his efforts spreads the philosophy throughout Asia. When India regained its independence from British rule in 1947, Ashoka's chakra was chosen as the central icon of the country's flag. Cyrus the Great. It's 600 BCE, and a king named Astyages is lying awake in bed, troubled by a strange dream. In his vision, he saw an ocean of water flowing from his daughter that swept through not only his kingdom of Media, but flooded all of Asia as well. The next morning, he's still troubled by this dream, and he seeks counsel from his magi, whose interpretation chills him to the bone. The dream was an omen that the offspring of his daughter would one day challenge him for the rule of his empire. To prevent this, he quickly marries her off to a mild-mannered Persian king named Cambyses I. Phew, ain't no way any great conqueror is gonna come from Persia. But just a year after the marriage, Astyages has another dream. This time, his daughter stands before him and vines suddenly begin to grow from her back. The vines grow so large that they entangle all of Asia. Astyages is again freaked out, and again he goes to see his magi, who confirms his worst fears. The son of his daughter will dethrone him and go on to rule an empire that stretches to the four corners of the world. The words of his magi scare the crap out of Astyages, and he decides then and there that he'll do everything he can to ensure this prophecy never comes true. But before he can even think of a plan, his daughter becomes pregnant and gives birth to a boy. Astyages orders his most trusted general, a man named Harpagus, to immediately travel to Persia and kill the child. Loyal to his king, the general makes the journey, rips the infant from the hands of its mother, and walks away as she begs for him to stop. Harpagus carries the baby out of the city, but as he looks down at the newborn, he finds he just doesn't have it in him to take the life of an infant. So instead, he gives the baby to a shepherd and tells him to go leave it in the woods to die. As ordered, the shepherd takes the baby and carries it off into the woods, but unknown to Harpagus, the wife of the shepherd had just given birth to a stillborn child. As he walks into the wood, he stares into the eyes of the infant, and he can't help but to think of his own child and what could have been. The shepherd decides to disobey Harpagus and brings the baby home, and he and his wife decide to secretly raise him as their own. They name the boy Agradates, and the shepherd buries their own stillborn son and gives Harpagus the location of the body. As far as everyone else knows, the matter's settled. The royal infant is dead. So Agradates is raised in the countryside away from the royal family, completely unaware of his lineage, and he grows into a strong, charismatic boy. One day, at the age of 10, he's playing with some other kids, and in their game, he gets named the king. As king, he orders around the other boys, and they all play along, except this one kid who was the son of a Median noble. When the kid refuses to listen, Agradates orders the other boys to rough him up to teach him a lesson for not listening to their king. The noble boy goes home crying and tells on Agradates, and the boy's dad can't stand the injustice, and he immediately goes to Astyages to complain to get this shepherd boy punished. Agradates and his shepherd father are brought to the throne room in Media, and at first look, Astyages is immediately suspicious. This boy looks exactly like him, and is the same age his dead grandson would be. And on top of all this, he speaks and conducts himself with class far above a commoner. He turns to the shepherd and demands the truth. Who is this boy? The shepherd defends that this is his son, until Astyages threatens him with severe punishment if he's lying, at which point he reveals everything. The king is furious, not so much at the shepherd, but at his most trusted general who had failed him. Harpagus is summoned to the throne room, and as he enters, he sees the shepherd and the boy, and immediately knows he's f***ed. Harpagus knows there's no use in lying, so he tells the truth. But surprisingly, the king seems to keep his cool. He tells Harpagus that he had often felt bad about, killing his grandson, and he's actually somewhat relieved that he's still alive. Tell you what, let's celebrate his return tonight. Come back later and, could you please send your 13-year-old son a little earlier so my grandson will have a companion? Harpagus is relieved and goes home and tells his wife and kid what's going on. He sends his son to the palace early, not thinking anything of it, and starts to get freshened up for the feast. When his son arrives at the palace, Astyages orders his soldiers to kill him and chop him into pieces. Some parts of the boy are then roasted, and other parts are boiled. These cooked pieces of human flesh were then placed on silver platters for later in the evening. At the royal feast, Harpagus is seated with other nobles, and mutton is served to everyone. Harpagus's mutton looks a little different, but the king seems to be in a good mood, so they all eat up. Once everyone's stuffed, Astyages asks Harpagus for a little help. He calls for his attendants, who bring in a basket and places it directly in front of Harpagus. He orders him to lift the basket. Hesitantly, he follows the king's commands and is horrified to see the head and hands of his son. Astyages, with an evil grin, then asks Harpagus if he enjoyed his meal. A little gamey, perhaps? Harpagus comes to the sickening realization that he had just eaten his own son for dinner. Against all odds, he maintains his composure and simply states, "Whatever my king does pleases me." He asks to keep the remains of his son, which he calmly takes and buries at home. But secretly, he never forgives the king and will spend the rest of his life plotting his revenge. Feeling pretty proud about the way he dealt with that idiot Harpagus, Astyages now has to figure out what to do with this grandchild he had feared. I mean, he could just kill him and get it over with, but instead he seeks the counsel of his magi again, who tells him that technically the prophecy had come true. The boy had become a king in the game he was playing, so now he doesn't pose any threat. Relieved, Astyages apologizes to the boy and sends him to be raised in Persia by his biological parents, who are both confused but also happy that their son they thought was dead for 10 years is somehow still alive. They rename him Cyrus II after his Persian grandfather. While in Persia, Cyrus grows to be a strong and capable leader, and when Cambyses passes away, he assumes the throne and begins setting his sights on larger conquests. He soon realizes that the greatness he desires will be impossible if he's still under the thumb of his grandfather, and he begins plotting ways to regain Persia's independence. Back in Media, Harpagus gets wind that Cyrus may have higher ambitions, and he sends him a secret message. In his letter, he reminds Cyrus of how his grandfather wanted him killed, and that if Persia were to lead a rebellion against Media, he would turn his forces against Astyages and fight alongside him. This sounds like a pretty good deal, but Cyrus has one last problem. Persia is less of a kingdom and more of a scattering of tribes that kind of tolerate a ruler. If he wants to have any success against his grandfather, he first needs to unite these tribes to fight as a unified army. As the new ruler of Persia, he orders men from across his lands to a forest and orders them to clear it within a day. Not knowing what kind of ruler Cyrus is going to be, the men begrudgingly do so, and by the end of the day are completely exhausted. The next day, Cyrus again calls them back to the same spot. The aching men head back to the forest, thinking this Cyrus guy might need to be taken care of quickly if he keeps this up. But when they arrive, they're shocked to find Cyrus with an incredible feast laid out in the clearing. He invites them to eat, and instead of working, the men spend the whole day relaxing, drinking, and eating the most delicious food they've ever tasted. As the sun begins to set, Cyrus stands before them and says, "Persians, you have the power to shape your own future. If you follow me, you will enjoy days like today and even better ones without having to endure hard labor. But if you go against my plans, you will face hardships worse than what you experienced yesterday. I speak to you as a voice of freedom. It seems that Providence has chosen me to bring prosperity to you. You are just as capable and brave as the Medes. Knowing this, refuse to continue obeying Astyages." The men erupt into cheers. Finally, a true leader has come to save them from the tyranny of the Median Empire. With full support of all the clans in Persia, Cyrus quickly raises an army and leads an all-out assault against his grandfather's forces. Astyages orders Harpagus to command his army to defend his lands and stop this revolt. But when the two armies meet on the battlefield, Harpagus does as he'd promised, turns his men and begins attacking the remaining Median soldiers. His revenge against Astyages has begun. Cyrus, with the help of Harpagus, goes on to dethrone his grandfather and establishes what will be known as the Achaemenid Empire. Exactly as Astyages saw in his dreams, this new empire quickly grows and at its peak stretches from the Mediterranean to the Indus River, the largest empire the world had ever seen to this point. And unlike his grandfather, Cyrus rules with fairness and equality. He's loved by everyone in his land throughout his reign and long after he dies. So much so that he even snags an honorable mention in the Bible for being a cool guy. Today, we're going over the most unlikely heroes in history. John Paul Jones. It's 1768 and disaster has struck the Scottish trading vessel John. On its way back to Scotland, the ship's captain and first mate both died of yellow fever, and now the crew have found themselves without a leader in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. With no one wanting to take charge, the crew votes for a 21-year-old sailor named John Paul to take command, and against all odds, the young man's able to bring the ship home. The owners of the ship, expecting a total loss, are amazed that their crew and cargo were saved by such a young man and give him his own ship to command as a reward. Seemingly overnight, John Paul's life had changed forever, but he would soon find out that being a captain was much harder than he expected. On just his second voyage, John Paul finds himself dealing with a mutiny against his crew over wages. Being so young and eager to assert his authority, he finds the leader of the group and begins flogging him as punishment. Be grateful you even get paid what you get, and that goes the same for all of you. Sir, I think he's dead. Uh-oh. The leader of the mutiny wasn't actually dead, but he did die a few weeks later, which gets John Paul arrested for involvement in his death. He makes bail, but leaves Scotland to captain a London-registered trading ship and heads off to Tobago. But his old habits die hard, and the new crew mutinies against him, and this time he kills the leader of the rebellion with a sword. Now a murderer, John Paul abandons his ship and runs away to the American colonies and ends up in Virginia. There, he changes his name to John Paul Jones and decides to lay low. Though he always had believed he was destined for greatness, he had at last accepted this was probably not his fate. But everything changes in April of 1775 when British forces clash with rebel colonists at the Battle of Lexington, sparking the American War for Independence. There was no turning back from what was later called the shot heard round the world, and within a month, thousands of British troops pour into the colonies. The newly formed Continental Navy puts out calls for experienced sailors to join the fight to help defend the American coast, and former ship captain John Paul volunteers for service. Now, I think it's important to understand just what our guy John Paul Jones and the rest of the Continental Navy was up against. The colonies had a few dozen ships in their fleet, made up of mostly converted merchant and fishing vessels, and these men had the unenviable task of going up against the most powerful navy in the world, who had hundreds of warships at their disposal. Trying to engage the British in a direct battle would have been instant death, so instead, the Continental Navy focuses on raiding merchant and supply ships, ports, and prisons. John Paul takes to this unconventional warfare like a duck to water, and he soon rises through the ranks, and by the end of 1776, he's made a captain with command of his own ship. But the ship John Paul is given is a sloop, and he's constantly passed over for command of the bigger, more powerful warships. He begins to make a stink about it, and eventually he gets so annoying that the higher-ups tell him to take his ship, the USS Ranger, to France to, quote, do things that help the American war effort. Basically, they were just trying to get rid of him. And so, on November 1st, 1777, with no clear orders and a chip on his shoulder, John Paul set sail for the Old World. Upon arrival in France, the captain meets Benjamin Franklin, who was serving as one of America's ambassadors. Franklin also initially found John Paul to be arrogant and kind of annoying, but over time, they became friends. John Paul was fearless and had bold plans on how to take the fight to the British, and soon he proved he was exactly what an underdog Continental Navy needed. In the first weeks of April 1778, the Ranger sinks 3 enemy ships and captures another in British waters. Then, against the objection of his entire crew, John Paul attempts to raid the critical British port of Whitehaven. Though the attack failed, the idea of Americans directly attacking the home island quickly spread fear and anger throughout Britain. The very next day after the failed raid, John Paul and his crew attempt to kidnap the Earl of Selkirk. They aren't successful here either, only managing to take some silverware, but just a few hours later, he attacks the HMS Drake, which was nearby. The two ships engage in a brutal hour-long gunfight, and in the end, John Paul and his crew are victorious and capture the ship. Most people would call it quits right there. But immediately after he secures the Drake, John Paul sails off and captures 2 more ships and sank a few smaller ones before the day was done. And I just have to point out that he did all of this in just 1 month. The Ranger and HMS Drake sail victoriously into the French port of Brest in early May to much excitement. The capture of the Drake turned the Ranger into a legendary ship amongst the Americans, and at the same time, John Paul's actions infuriated the British, who quickly classified him as a pirate. Against all odds, the unknown fugitive on the run had become a hero of the American Revolution, but his next battle would take him from a hero to a legend. Following the capture of the Drake, John Paul is given command of a converted merchant ship, which he names the Bonhomme Richard, the French translation of Poor Richard's Almanac, which was written by his good friend Benjamin Franklin. Franklin gives John Paul a fleet of ships to command, and unsurprisingly, given his now infamous lack of people skills, he immediately pisses off the captains of all the other ships. Particularly, the captain of the USS Alliance hated John Paul so much that he refused to meet with him, stating that if they were together, they would be forced to kill each other. Nevertheless, John Paul takes the Bonhomme Richard and his unwilling fleet to harass British cargo ships in the North Sea, and on the evening of September 23rd, John Paul discovers a large merchant convoy off the eastern coast of England. Guarding the convoy was the brand new 44-gun HMS Serapis. John Paul immediately gives the order for his fleet to follow him in attacking the Serapis head-on, but the captain of the Alliance, who remember hated John Paul, refused, thinking it was a dumb idea, and instead splits off and targets the support ships. No matter, Jones was determined, and the Richard barrels headfirst towards the Serapis. As night falls, the 2 ships finally drift within firing range, and John Paul gives the signal to attack. Immediately, cannons aboard the Bonhomme Richard explode in a fiery fury, but not in the way John Paul wanted. See, wanting some bigger guns than the French had initially given him, John Paul had purchased some at a discount from a scrapyard. Well, turns out these cannons were in the scrapyard for a reason, and many of them exploded on their first use, killing many of John Paul's gunners. The Serapis, on the other hand, had no such issue, and began unloading a heavy barrage into the now smoking Bonhomme Richard. Seeing his crew begin to panic, John Paul rushes to one of the few remaining cannons and begins desperately firing it at the British ship. He realizes that if things continue this way, they'll all be blown to bits. He needs to do something, and quick, so he shouts for his men to prepare to board and gives the command to ram the ship. The Bonhomme Richard crashes headfirst into the stern of the Serapis. The British captain, seeing the ravaged American ship up close, mockingly shouts, "Ha! Are you surrendering?" To which John Paul shouts back, "I have not yet begun to fight!" The ships detach, and again the Serapis unloads another lethal barrage into the Richard, punching massive holes below its waterline. The situation aboard the American ship turns desperate. The Richard is taking on water fast, and between shots of his own cannon and pistol, John Paul orders for another attempt to bring the ship within boarding range. Just when all hope looks lost for John Paul, rigging on the two ships become intertwined and they slam into each other broadside to broadside. Now unable to escape, the British fire their cannons directly into the Richard, blasting more holes through the sinking ship. John Paul sends his men up the masts with grape shot and grenades and orders them to begin picking off the British sailors on deck. The Americans are barely holding on when suddenly things get even worse. Cannon fire rings out in the distance and shells rock the Bonhomme Richard. Fueled by an equal hatred of the British and John Paul, the captain of the USS Alliance had begun firing on both ships, trying to take two birds out with one stone. Things were now dire for the Americans as the British continued to fire on them, preventing them from boarding. But in the chaos, one of the sailors who John Paul had ordered up the mast crossed to the end of the yardarm unnoticed with a handful of grenades. As he peered down onto the deck of the Serapis, he spots a small hatch, and he begins to try to throw grenades into it. He misses on his first few attempts, but finally scores a direct hit. In the blink of an eye, a huge explosion erupts from every porthole and hatch on the British ship, and sailors are sent flying into the air as the Serapis catches on fire. The lucky grenade had ignited a gunpowder reserve and killed over 20 men, and in an instant, the outcome of the battle is now a toss-up. With both ships heavily damaged, the British and American sailors charge each other and melee combat breaks out on both decks. The glint of swords and musket fire illuminate the battle for spectators watching from the shore. Under increasing pressure, some aboard John Paul's ship attempt to surrender, and according to some accounts, he shoots them for treason. The crews continue to fight for over an hour until the British captain finally breaks. He pulls down his ship's flag and steps aboard the Bonhomme Richard. He then walks to John Paul and personally delivers it and his sword and surrenders. Though the Bonhomme Richard was damaged beyond repair and sank the following day, John Paul Jones proved that the Continental Navy could challenge the best the British Navy had to offer. His victory inspired the French to increase their support to the struggling colonies, and when he returned to France, King Louis XVI made him a knight, and he was awarded a medal for his valiant service by the new American government. Though he died in relative obscurity, probably related to his piss-poor people skills, John Paul Jones is considered a hero in the U.S. today and widely recognized as the father of the American Navy. Desmond Doss. It's the late 1920s in Lynchburg, Virginia, and a young boy named Desmond Doss and his family are finishing up a meal at his uncle's home. His father and uncle had begun discussing some boring topics, so Desmond leaves the table with his mom to go to the living room as the two men continue to drink together. The night goes on, and Desmond can hear the conversation in the dining room slowly becoming louder and more heated. His father and uncle throw back more shots, and they begin slurring their words and shouting insults at each other. The argument between the two men becomes so loud that a neighbor had called the police, and soon the blare of sirens can be heard in the distance. Desmond and his mother walk into the dining room to tell the men to settle down. But as they step through the doorway, they watch in horror as his father slams his fist on the table, stands, and draws his pistol. Desmond watches as his father menacingly points his gun directly at his uncle as his mother bolts in between the two men. "The police are on their way," she says as she grabs the pistol from her husband's hand and tosses it to her son. "Hide that gun!" Desmond bolts out of the house and runs as fast as he can back home. He hides the gun and races back to his uncle's house just in time to see his father being arrested. As he watches the police load his father into a black paddy wagon, Desmond's mind races with thoughts. His mother had raised him as a strict Seventh-day Adventist, and he knew the Bible well. He thought of the story of Cain and Abel and realized that if his mother had not stepped in at that moment, his father would also have killed his own brother. How could anyone do that? The sixth commandment says, "Thou shalt not kill." In that moment, Desmond Doss swears he will never touch a gun again, a decision that would one day turn him into one of the most unlikeliest heroes in military history. December 7th, 1941 was a day that shocked the nation. The Empire of Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, plunging the United States headfirst into World War II. In the days that followed the bombing of Pearl Harbor, young men across the United States rushed to enlist to join the war. Desmond at the time was working at a Navy shipyard and was offered a draft deferment, but he could not stand idly by and officially joined the U.S. Army on April 1st, 1942. But when he reported for duty, the commanding officers were shocked to find out that their newest recruit refused to carry a rifle due to his religion. Desmond applies to work as a combat medic, but wanting to get rid of him, the Army officially designated him as a conscientious objector, and they send him to join a rifle company thinking this would break him and make him quit on his own. At basic training, when his fellow soldiers find out the new guy won't carry a rifle, they conclude he was just trying to figure out a way to get out of the war, so they mocked him relentlessly. They threw boots at his head while he said his nightly prayers and threatened to shoot him themselves if they were ever deployed together. Things only got worse for Desmond when he insisted on observing the Sabbath on Saturdays and requested permission to attend church services on that day. This made everyone hate him even more, and many refused to eat with him, train with him, or even speak to him. The officers eventually gave up trying to make Desmond quit and reassigned him to the 77th Infantry Division as a combat medic. But unsurprisingly, the recruits there also hated him for the exact same reasons. They saw him as a liability, and after trying their own hand at bullying and standard methods of getting him out, a commanding officer who had taken extreme offense at Desmond's refusal to touch any weapon tries and fails to get him court-martialed for refusing orders. But as horrible an experience as basic training was, Desmond endures, and eventually he and the rest of his division are shipped out to fight in the Pacific Theater in March of 1944. Armed only with a Bible, Desmond would soon prove every man who had called him a coward dead wrong. The 77th Infantry Division lands on the shores of Guam in May, and immediately Desmond is given a close look at hell on earth. The Japanese attack without mercy, and American casualties quickly begin to pile up. As enemy bullets whizzed past and mortar shells exploded around him, Desmond ran headfirst into battle to treat fallen comrades and carry them to safety. Against orders, he begins crawling into no man's land at night, searching for the injured and dragging fellow soldiers back to camp, saving many of their lives. In engagements in Guam and the Philippines, Desmond again and again fearlessly charges into battle unarmed and brings back wounded soldiers to safety, and soon stories of his heroism spreads throughout the entire battalion. By the time he left Leyte, Desmond had earned 2 Bronze Stars with a V device for exceptional valor. But as bad as the fighting had been so far, the 77th had no idea they would soon participate in one of the most bloody battles in World War II as they sailed toward the island of Okinawa. In May 1945, the Japanese troops were fiercely defending their last stronghold before their main islands, and as Desmond and his unit arrived to relieve the 96th Infantry Battalion, they were greeted with trucks stacked to the brim with dead American soldiers. The mud on the battlefields was stained red from days of brutal combat, and these sights shocked the 77th as they proceeded to the area that had stalled the previous company's progress, a 300-foot escarpment that the Americans had nicknamed Hacksaw Ridge. The Japanese had spent years fortifying the cliff with an intricate network of tunnels, bunkers, and firing positions. Wave after wave of soldiers attempted to take the ridge, but were driven back nightly by the Japanese. Machine gun fire from the defenders was so intense that the rounds sawed men in half, and 8 company commanders died in less than 36 hours trying to take the escarpment. Soon it was Desmond's unit, Company B's turn to try to take the ridge. The 155 soldiers of Company B stormed up the escarpment and were greeted with heavy fire from the Japanese. After hours of fighting, the day was lost, and 55 soldiers managed to retreat down the cliff, with the rest either dead or too injured to make it down themselves. The survivors of the engagement look up from below and see a lone medic standing on the ridge. With bullets flying all around him, Desmond Doss charged into the battlefield and dragged men back to the cliff and lowered them down to safety. After lowering the wounded and seeing they had been taken by medics on the ground, Desmond silently prayed, "Please, Lord, just help me get one more," and rushed back into enemy fire to retrieve another fallen soldier. Knowing the Japanese would torture anyone they found, Desmond refused to leave a single American soldier on that ridge, and over the span of 12 hours, he single-handedly rescued 75 men. The following day, a Saturday, the commanders asked Desmond if he'll be able to do his duty on the Sabbath. After some thought, he requested some time to read his Bible before they tried to take the ridge. The commanders and all the soldiers who had ridiculed him for months held up the assault and wait for Desmond to finish his prayers. When he was done, he gives his commander a nod, and the Americans begin their climb up the cliffs. By the end of the day, they held Hacksaw Ridge. A few days later, Desmond is injured in battle and loses his Bible in the process of being evacuated. When the soldiers of B Company find out, they risk their lives to search the battlefield and eventually return it to their medic. In August of 1945, the Japanese announced their surrender, and in October of the same year, Desmond Doss smiled for reporters on the lawn of the White House as he received the Congressional Medal of Honor from President Truman, the first conscientious objector to ever receive the award. Sergeant Stubby. It's July of 1917, and a stray Boston Terrier mutt is wandering around the campus of Yale University looking for something to eat. While sifting through some trash, he looks up and sees a group of soldiers marching in formation. Curious, he follows them to a military training camp that had been built on the school's football field. The dog wanders into camp and watches as the men go through their exercises. One of the soldiers notices him and walks over and pets him on the head. This was the first time the dog had ever been shown any kind of affection from a human, and so he begins to show up to the camp every day. And soon, a private named James Conroy notices the dog and starts calling him Stubby. Conroy starts feeding him, and eventually he and all the other soldiers in the unit adopt him as their pet. The soldiers teach him tricks, and he begins sleeping at the camp with them. In just a few short months, the dog went from roaming the streets to having a name, a family, and a home. But one chilly October morning, a nervous Private Conroy scoops Stubby up and quickly pulls him into his overcoat. Stubby doesn't know what's going on, and when Conroy finally lets him free, he finds himself on the deck of a huge ship. It turns out the soldiers who were training at Yale were now being deployed as one of the first National Guard units to fight in the Great War. On their way to Europe, Stubby is eventually discovered by the commanding officer aboard the ship.
"Get rid of that filthy dog, Conroy."
"But sir, he's one of us."
"He is not."
Okay, he can stay. Having won over the commanding officer, Stubby is officially made the regiment's mascot and allowed to freely travel with Private Conroy and the unit. The Americans arrive in France, and in February, they're sent to fight on the Western Front. Though things are initially quiet, everything changes in February of 1918 when the Germans begin to use chemical warfare on the American positions, and Stubby is nearly killed by a gas attack. Though he recovered, he never forgot the smell of the gas that almost did him in, and he would quickly become an early warning system for incoming gas attacks, barking at the first scent of danger. By March, the relative quiet Stubby and the American Expeditionary Force had enjoyed was completely shattered as the Germans launched their spring offensive. Shells begin raining down on the Americans, and firefights break out day and night. As he watches Conroy fire his rifle, Stubby hears loud whistling overhead. He looks around at his fellow soldiers, but they don't seem to hear anything in the chaos. He jumps up, barking at Conroy, biting his leg and pulling him towards cover. Stubby runs to the next soldier and continues pulling people towards shelter until all of the unit realize what he's doing. Artillery shells soon rained down all around them. Stubby had saved their lives. A first for the brave dog, but definitely not the last. By April, the Americans have the Germans on the run, and Stubby follows Conroy into no man's land as the Americans push towards the enemy lines. But as they advance forward, a retreating German soldier throws a grenade that finds its way right next to their position. It explodes near Stubby, and shrapnel digs deep into his legs and chest. Conroy frantically rushes Stubby to the field hospital where the doctors are able to save his life. While recovering from his wounds, he wandered the field hospital, visiting fellow soldiers, performing the tricks they taught him to cheer them up. Soon, Stubby returns to the front lines, and he quickly begins demonstrating a new skill of finding wounded soldiers and barking to bring medics to treat them. Night after night, he runs out into danger and helps to find and rescue dozens of wounded soldiers. One night, as Stubby was heading out to search for more wounded, he runs into a man he had never seen before in the American trenches. The man begins trying to call to Stubby, but he steps back and begins barking and snarling at the stranger. His hair stands up on his neck and he bares his teeth. Nearby soldiers hear him and walk over to check out what's going on. In an instant, the man turns to run. Stubby leaps forward, sinking his teeth into his leg and knocking him face down into the thick mud. The American soldiers arrive and find an iron cross pin on the stranger. Stubby had single-handedly found and captured a German spy. For this, the command officer nominates Stubby for the rank of sergeant, which everyone begins calling him, but he never officially receives the rank because, well, he was a dog. When some local French women hear about the hero dog's exploits, they knit him a small uniform, which he wears proudly. Conroy pins his rank and 2 wound stripes onto the jacket along with a French campaign medal and the Iron Cross taken from the German spy he'd captured. Stubby would fight alongside Private Conroy and the rest of the American Expeditionary Force until the end of the war, and against all odds, the pair would survive the conflict and make it back to the States where they were welcomed as heroes. Stubby would go on to meet 3 U.S. presidents and go down in history as the most decorated American animal in World War I. After the war, Stubby lived out the rest of his life with Conroy and went with him to law school at Georgetown University, where he became the football team's mascot. As if he already hadn't accomplished enough in his short life, during halftime breaks at home games, Stubby would rush out onto the field and nudge a football around to entertain fans, creating one of the first ever documented halftime shows in history. All in all, not too bad for a stray mutt from Connecticut.
Today we're going over extreme survival stories of people who refused to die. John Colter. It's 1809, and frontiersman John Colter and his friend John Potts are paddling a canoe up the Jefferson River. The 2 men are hunting for beaver pelts on this expedition, and they both know that they have just crossed into some very dangerous territory. Just a few years earlier, Colter was part of the legendary Lewis and Clark expedition that mapped the previously unexplored American West. While traveling in what is now Montana, the party had some not-so-friendly encounters with the native Blackfeet Indians, who have lived in this region for generations. These tribes had begun working with British fur companies and now saw the American presence in the area as bad for business. Colter could not help but notice the demand for beaver pelts was skyrocketing, and so, in 1806, 2 months before the official end of the expedition, he asked to be honorably discharged, and he chose to stay out in the wilderness to try to strike it rich. But John was soon given a lesson on just how much the local tribes did not appreciate American fur trappers on their turf. In 1808, the Blackfeet had ambushed him and shot an arrow in his leg. Had the Flathead and Crow Indians he was traveling with not chased them away, he would have been dead. Now well aware that the Blackfeet did not want them around, the duo were doing everything they could to avoid them at all costs. Colter and Potts continued rowing in silence, hoping that they could pass through unnoticed. But as they turned the corner, a cold shiver ran down their spine as hundreds of Blackfeet warriors began stepping out of the forest and onto the riverbank. The natives don't seem to be very interested in doing business, and they gesture for the men to come to them. Colter knows they don't have a lot of options here, so he nervously brings the canoe to shore. The instant he steps onto land, the Blackfeet strip him naked and take his rifle, knife, and gear. As he watches Colter being stripped bare, Potts begins to imagine the horrific things the Blackfeet have in store for them, and he refuses to get off the canoe. The warriors begin to lose their patience, and one of them shoots an arrow into him for his stubbornness. Potts, now bleeding, panics and grabs his rifle. He fires at one of the warriors, and instantly the Blackfeet return, a storm of arrows that turn his body into a pincushion. Horrified, Colter can do nothing but stand there and watch as Potts is dragged ashore and hacked to pieces. He assumes he's next, but instead, the chief unexpectedly points to the open prairie and tells him to run. Colter couldn't believe what was happening. He was being spared, and so he takes off, sprinting butt naked as fast as he could. He gets a few hundred yards away when suddenly, war cries echo out in the distance behind him, and it dawns on him that he had not been set free after all. He was simply given a head start. This was a hunt, and he was their prey. Naked, alone, and now running for his life, Colter sprints ahead. He knows that about 6 miles away is the Madison River. If he can just make it there, he may have a chance of getting away. Every step drives sharp rocks into his bare feet, and his legs are ripped up by shrubs. But Coulter pushes himself harder than he ever has before. His lungs burning, he keeps running until his vision starts to blur and blood begins pouring from his nose from the sheer strain. After traveling what felt like a few miles, he stops to try to catch his breath and turns to see if he had lost the Indians. To his horror, one warrior had caught up and found him and was now just 20 yards away. Exhausted and knowing he can't outrun the man, he quickly turns to fight. The Indian, who is running at a full clip towards Coulter, is startled when the naked white man suddenly whips around and aggressively raises his arms towards him. He stumbles to the ground and breaks his spear. On instinct, Coulter rushes over, grabs the broken spear, and drives it into the warrior, killing him. The frontiersman takes a blanket the young Blackfoot was carrying, and as a group of warriors draws near, he takes off running again. He reaches the river, bleeding from his feet and nose, barely able to stand. He can hear the natives getting closer behind him. His legs are completely dead, and he begins desperately searching for somewhere to hide. As the voices of the warriors grow louder and louder, Coulter spots a beaver lodge and dives into the icy water. He swims beneath the lodge and finds a small pocket of air just big enough to keep his face above the surface. Alright, the beaver lodge was probably empty, but I thought it was funny. Anyways, when the Blackfeet arrive moments later, there is no sign of the naked white man they had been pursuing. They circle the area for hours, and Coulter does his best to remain perfectly still beneath the lodge as the freezing water numbs his entire body. After what seems like an eternity, night falls, and the sounds of the Blackfeet warriors fade into the distance. In near darkness, Coulter slips back into the river and swims a few miles downstream. He crawls ashore, shaking and half frozen, but he is alive. For the next 11 days, with just the blanket he stole from the warrior, he keeps moving through harsh terrain, surviving on roots and berries. He forces his broken body more than 300 miles through mountains and valleys, until finally he reaches a trading fort on the Little Bighorn. As he stumbles in, he is nearly unrecognizable. He's thin, exhausted, and bleeding everywhere. But, against all odds, he lived to tell the tale. Leonid Rogozov. It's September 1960, and a 26-year-old surgeon, Leonid Rogozov, steps off his ship and onto the frozen continent of Antarctica. A few months earlier, the Soviet Union had announced its 6th Antarctic expedition and was looking for a doctor willing to spend 2 years at the Novozarevskaya station, one of the most remote research stations on Earth. Leonid had been studying to become a surgeon, but when he heard the news, he dropped everything and quickly applied to join the expedition. He's chosen and is assigned to join the 13-man research team as its sole doctor. As Leonid excitedly walks to the station, he can't believe how quickly his life has changed. But he is completely unaware that soon he would be fighting for his life with nothing but a scalpel and a mirror. By January 1961, the station is fully functional, and Leonid settles into his role as the only physician for the crew. For the first few months, everything is going according to plan, and luckily, the researchers seem pretty good at keeping themselves healthy in these extreme conditions. But on the morning of April 29th, Leonid wakes up and something is not right. He feels weak and nauseous. By midday, he's running a fever and a sharp stabbing pain has moved to his lower right abdomen. Leonid knows that this could be very bad. These are all hallmarks of appendicitis, something that can be life-threatening if not treated immediately. So, he starts taking antibiotics and presses ice against his abdomen. He's hoping the infection is minor and this will be all it takes to clear it up. But by the morning of April 30th, the pain is so bad he can barely move. His fever keeps climbing and he begins to vomit uncontrollably. The antibiotics were not enough. This infection had progressed to the point where the outlook was now very grim. His appendix could rupture, and if it did, he would only survive hours to days without proper treatment. The nearest Soviet research station with another doctor is over 1,000 miles away, and to make things even worse, a severe blizzard had rolled in, making it impossible for any planes to land at Novozarevskaya to rescue him. The researchers at the station watch helplessly as their doctor's condition continues to worsen. There's nothing they can do, and they realize they may have to helplessly watch him die. Leonid stares at the ceiling of his small room, his mind running through all of his options. In the end, he decides surgery is the only thing that can save his life, and he is the only person who can do it. He recruits 3 of his colleagues to help him as assistants, and he begins prepping himself for surgery. He orders one of the researchers to hold a mirror near his abdomen so he can see what he's doing during the surgery. He places another researcher near his tools so he can call for them as needed, and he gives the third man a shot of adrenaline and instructs the researcher to stand by and use it on him if he passes out. At 2 a.m. on May 1st, Leonid nods to his assistants, adjusts himself into a half-sitting position, and injects himself with a local anesthetic. Looking at the mirror, he picks up a scalpel and makes a 4-inch cut on his right side. He continues to cut through layers of muscle and tissue, but he struggles using the mirror to see and eventually begins working through touch alone. He can feel the warmth of his blood seeping out over his hands as he searches for his appendix. As he's working blindly in the hole he had cut into himself, he accidentally cuts his large intestine. Leonid quickly calls for sutures, and he's forced to sew it back together before he can continue to his appendix. 40 minutes have now passed, and his vision begins to blur. His head starts to spin, and he becomes nauseous. He begins to take short 30-second breaks every 4 minutes to regain his focus, using all of his concentration to not black out mid-surgery. After almost an hour of cutting and feeling around his abdomen, Leonid finally locates his appendix. But at that exact moment, he feels his heart rate slow, and his hands begin to lose sensation. He battles back through the brink of blacking out, grips his scalpel, and quickly removes his appendix. As he inspects it, he sees a dark stain at its base and deduces that if it was not removed, it would have burst within a day. He fights through the vertigo and nausea and sews himself back together. Nearly 2 hours after he had made the initial cut into himself, the surgery was completed, and Leonid, exhausted both mentally and physically, collapses on the table. Over the next few days, he continues to suffer from a high fever, and his colleagues worry that their doctor still won't make it. But on day 5, his fever finally breaks, and in 2 weeks, Leonid is back on his feet performing his regular duties. Operating on yourself and then continuing to do your job as if nothing had happened is, not gonna lie, kind of impressive. And I guess even the Soviet government thought so too, as Leonid was later awarded the Order of the Red Banner of Labor for his bravery and service to the Soviet state. Julianne Kopka. It's December 24th, 1971, and 17-year-old Julianne Kopka is sitting next to her mother as their plane takes off into the sky. A day earlier, Julianne had graduated from high school in Lima, and now she's finally going back home to spend Christmas with her dad. Her parents were world-renowned zoologists who were living at a research station they'd established deep in the Amazon rainforest. The original plan was for Julianne to return to the research station a few days earlier, but wanting to participate in her graduation ceremony, she convinced her mother to stay with her and fly back on Christmas Eve instead. But being Christmas, all the flights out of Lima were booked solid, and the only airline with available seats was LANSA, an airline with a poor reputation for safety. Julianne's father urged his wife not to book with LANSA, but thinking this was a short 1-hour flight, Julianne's mom booked the tickets, and they were now aboard LANSA Flight 508, heading home. Their plane climbs to cruising altitude, and everything seems fine. But roughly 30 minutes after takeoff, Julianne looks out the window and sees dark clouds and flashes of lightning surrounding them. The pilot had chosen to fly directly into a thunderstorm, and soon the entire aircraft began shaking violently. The aircraft is tossed in the storm, and luggage is rattled out of the overhead bins. Passengers begin to scream with every bump as the plane moves more and more erratically. Julianne holds her mother's hand tightly, but both are unable to speak out of fear. Suddenly, the panic in the cabin is drowned out by a massive bang from outside. When Julianne looks back out the window again, she sees that the plane's right wing is on fire. Terrified, she looks to her mom, who looks back at her and calmly says, "That is the end. It's all over." The plane's engines scream louder and louder as it drops into a nosedive, and within seconds, it begins to tear itself apart mid-air. Passengers are flown into the open sky, and when Julianne opens her eyes, the cabin is gone. Wind is ripping past her as she falls towards the rainforest below, still strapped into her bench seat. As the tree line accelerates towards her, she passes out. When she opens her eyes, it's the next morning. She was unconscious while it happened, but the rainforest canopy and the airplane seats she was strapped into had broken her fall, just enough to keep her from dying on impact. Somehow, she is still alive. She immediately calls out for her mother, but nobody answers. As she tries to stand, her head begins to spin from a brutal concussion. She stumbles through the wreckage, desperately searching for other passengers, but she is completely alone. As she checks herself, she realizes her collarbone is broken. She also has a deep gash along her right arm, a badly wounded knee, and an injured eye. To make matters worse, she's lost her glasses, and being short-sighted meant she was now nearly blind to the dangers lurking around her in the rainforest. But there was one thing that Julianne had that perhaps no one else who may have survived the crash had. During the 18 months she lived with her parents in the Amazon before high school, she learned the basics of how to survive in the jungle. She remembered that the best chance of survival in a situation like this was to find a river, because if she followed it long enough, it would eventually lead her to people. As she moves through the scattered wreckage, she finds a bag of sweets. With that as her only food, Julianne pushes forward through the thick jungle. For days, she hobbled through the rainforest alone, the calls of the animals around her providing an eerie soundtrack to her hike of desperation. At night, the cold winds leave her shivering as she curls up in a bush to try to sleep. As the days pass, the wound on her arm becomes infected, and botfly maggots start eating into her open flesh. On the fourth day, she finds a stream and begins to follow it. As she turns a corner, she sees something that sends shivers down her spine. In front of her are 3 dead passengers from her flight, all still strapped to their seats with their heads buried into the ground. It's the first time Julianne had ever seen a dead body, and she is initially frozen in fear. She works up the courage to approach the bodies to check the woman, dreading the idea that this could be her mom, but finds that the corpse's toenails are painted, something her mother never did. Staring at the passengers, the last bits of hope she was holding onto begin to slip away. She gathers herself and forces onward. The sound of moving water grows louder, and the creek suddenly opens into a wide river. She knows that if she continues to walk along the river, she could maybe find her way out. But after 10 days of stumbling through the forest, she is reaching her limit. Her bag of sweets ran out days ago, and now she was so weak she could barely stand. Just as she is about to give up, she spots a small boat tied to the riverbank. Using the last of her energy, she makes her way to the boat. She notices a narrow path leading into the trees, and it takes her to a small hut. She's saved! But when she gets there, no one is there. By now, the maggots in her arm were nearly 1 inch long. She remembered something her father did for one of their pets in the past, and she finds a can of gasoline in the hut. She sucks the gas out of the can and spits it onto her wound. The pain is excruciating as the maggots try to burrow deeper into the wound to escape the fuel, but she is able to pluck 30 of them out of her arm. Exhausted, Julianne falls to the ground inside the hut and falls asleep. The next morning, she wakes to the sound of voices and runs outside. When the men see Julianne, they are terrified and initially think she's a half-dolphin water goddess. But speaking in Spanish, she explains to them what happened. She was on the flight that crashed, and she is all alone. They treat her wounds, feed her, and the next day bring her back to civilization. Julianne is soon reunited with her father and learns that her mother is still missing. Officials continue to search for her mother, but her body is eventually found in January. She had also survived the plane crash, but was too injured to move and died a few days after the incident in the jungle. Of the 92 people aboard Lanza Flight 508, Julianne was the only survivor, and, in fact, she's still alive today. Today we're going over the most epic survival stories in history. Poon Lim. It's November 23rd, 1942, and 24-year-old Poon Lim is desperately clinging to a wooden plank in the vast emptiness of the Atlantic Ocean. Just moments earlier, he had been a steward aboard the SS Ben Lomond, a British merchant marine ship on its way to New York. Without warning, 2 massive explosions ripped through the vessel, and Lim was swept overboard. Fighting against the pull of the now sinking ship, he frantically swam toward what he hoped was the surface, his lungs burning for air. When he finally broke through, he looked around only to see the endless ocean stretching in every direction. He was completely alone. As he bobbed in the frigid water, trying to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around him, the German U-boat that had fired the torpedo suddenly surfaced. Its crew climbed onto the deck, and Poon Lim waved frantically, shouting for help. The Germans spotted him and burst into laughter. They mockingly waved back before again disappearing beneath the waves, leaving him to die. After 2 agonizing hours of drifting, Lim spotted a sign of hope. One of the few life rafts the crew of Ben Lomond had managed to launch before the ship went down was floating just a few hundred feet away. He desperately swims toward it and drags himself aboard. In the distance, he sees another raft carrying a handful of other survivors, and they begin waving for him to join them. But with no oars to steer, the raft slowly drifted apart until once again, he was completely alone. Aboard the raft, Lim finds some food, water, and signaling supplies. He began rationing carefully, clinging to hope that rescue would come soon, but days stretched into weeks, and his supplies dwindled to nothing. Realizing he would probably run out of food before he was rescued at this rate, Lim made a desperate decision. He would save his last piece of hardtack not to eat, but to use as bait. He fashioned a fishing hook from the spring in his flashlight and unraveled hemp rope for a fishing line. Surprisingly, the fish seemed to like the hardtack more than the sailors ever did, but his hook was too small to catch anything substantial. Using a nail he pried from the raft, he made a bigger hook and used the small fish he had been able to catch as bait. As his fresh water supply ran out, he rigged a canvas shelter to catch rainwater to drink. When seagulls began landing on his raft, Lim caught them for food as well. With no way to cook the birds, he butchered them, soaked the meat in seawater, and dried it into jerky under the scorching sun. Though the supplies he found on the raft had completely run out, he was now catching enough food to survive. But then the rain stopped completely, and soon he was left with nothing to drink. Sunburned and delirious with thirst, he watched as sharks began circling his raft. In this moment, Lim comes up with an idea only a man staring at death could come up with. Using seagull remains as bait, he tries to catch one of the sharks. He gets a bite and he uses all of his strength to pull the giant fish out of the water. Desperate beyond reason, he cuts it open and drinks the blood from its liver. A few days later, a cargo ship appears and Lim shouts to them in English, begging them to save him. But they ignore his request, the crew assuming he was a Japanese sailor. Later, American Navy patrol planes spot him and drop a buoy to mark his location for rescue. But before they could return, a violent storm swept Lim and his raft away into the vast ocean. Months pass, and Poon Lim gives up counting the days he has been lost at sea. Starving and sunburned, he's about to give up. But one morning, while gazing out at the water, he noticed something different. The color of the ocean had changed. He had drifted closer to shore. But where was he? And more crucially, could he survive long enough to be found? Finally, on April 5th, 1943, 4 months after the Ben Lomond's sinking, a Brazilian fishing boat spotted him just 9 miles off the coast of northern Brazil. Using the last of his strength, he stands and shouts for help, and the fishermen come to his rescue. By this point, Lim had lost 20 pounds and was so weak the fishermen had to lift his emaciated body from the raft into their boat. In a Brazilian hospital, Lim learned he was the sole survivor from his ship. He had survived for 133 days, drifting alone in the Atlantic Ocean. Poon Lim makes a full recovery and is later told that no one had ever survived longer on a raft at sea. He quickly replied, "I hope no one will ever have to break that record." Hugh Glass. It's August 1823, and a fur trapper named Hugh Glass is traveling along the Grand River in what is now modern-day South Dakota. This particular expedition was deep into Arikara Indian Territory, which made it particularly dangerous. But soon, Hugh would be fighting for his life against something much more fierce. While scouting ahead of his party for river crossings, Hugh inadvertently stumbles upon a mother grizzly bear with her cubs. The mama bear, on instinct to protect her young, lunges at Hugh and instantly begins to maul him. The bear tears deep gashes on his back and chest, exposing his ribs, breaks his leg, and slices his throat. The other trappers hear his screams and come running, finding Hugh being literally torn apart. They open fire, finally bringing down the beast. Hugh lies in a pool of his own blood, a mangled wreck that barely resembles a human being. Everyone present knows they're looking at a dead man walking. Or, rather, a dead man that had just been crumpled into a pretzel, I guess. They fashion a makeshift stretcher and drag him along for 2 days, but his weight slows their progress to a crawl through dangerous territory. Expecting Glass to die at any moment, the expedition leader offers $80 for volunteers to stay with him until the end and give him a proper burial. An old trapper named John Fitzgerald and a young man named Jim Bridger step forward, thinking they've just scored the easiest money of their lives. But days pass, and Hugh Glass refuses to die. Fitzgerald and Bridger watch as Hugh drifts in and out of consciousness. Each time they think he's gone, he lets out another painful groan. Poor old Hugh. It won't be long now. Yep, any minute. Oh my god, just fucking die already. 5 days pass and Hugh is still not dead. The trappers begin to panic. What if the Indians find them? They'd be sitting ducks. Hugh is obviously not going to make it, and there's no reason for him to take them with him. So in a moment of cold calculation, they decide to take Hugh's rifle, knife, and supplies and abandon him alone in the wilderness. Fitzgerald and Bridger quickly catch up with the main expedition and report that Hugh Glass had passed away. The other men accept this without question. After all, they'd seen what the guy looked like when they left. But against all odds, Hugh Glass did not die. And he finally wakes up only to find himself all alone and stripped of all his weapons and supplies. Enraged that Fitzgerald and Bridger had left him to die, he tries to stand but discovers his shattered leg won't support him and his entire body is covered with deep wounds. With grim determination, he sets his own broken leg and begins an impossible 200-mile journey toward Fort Kiowa, crawling on his belly like a broken animal. Every day he drags himself a few agonizing miles, eating berries, roots, bark, and bugs to survive. Maggots hatch from fly eggs in his festering wounds and begin devouring the rotting flesh on his back, which is super gross, but actually probably saved his life by preventing a deadlier infection that would have killed him. While any sane man would have surrendered to death, Hugh is driven by one burning obsession: revenge against the men who betrayed him, so he continues to drag himself along the river. But by this point, Hugh was starving. The berries and bugs he had been eating were not enough. He discovers a pack of wolves feasting on a freshly killed buffalo calf. When the wolves leave, he crawls to the carcass and claims it as his own, setting up camp and gorging himself on meat until his leg heals enough for him to limp onwards. Hugh reaches the Missouri River, and there, some friendly Lakota Indians give him a boat which he uses to float downstream. Finally, in October of 1823, Hugh Glass limped into Fort Kiowa. Against all odds, he had survived not only a vicious grizzly bear attack that should have killed him, but also a 6-week, 200-mile journey back through the wilderness, all alone. Now, for most people, surviving such an ordeal would probably be the end of their life on the frontier. But Hugh Glass couldn't forget the men who had left him to die. He wanted revenge, so as soon as he fully recovered, he bought a new rifle and supplies and set out to hunt down Fitzgerald and Bridger. For months, Hugh tracked through the wilderness, following the trail of the expedition that had written him off as dead. And on New Year's Eve, 1823, he walked into Fort Henry and found his former companions. The trappers stared in absolute terror as they watched a man who they thought was dead walk directly towards them. Once they confirmed he wasn't a ghost that was trying to haunt them, they peppered Hugh with questions, which he answered patiently. Finally, it was his turn to speak, and Hugh just had one question of his own. Where are Fitzgerald and Bridger? Bridger is called, and the young man cannot believe his eyes. Though Hugh intended to kill him, their conversation reveals that Fitzgerald was the one who decided to abandon him. Hugh forgives the young man and sets out to find and kill Fitzgerald, who had since left the party. For the next 6 months, Hugh wandered from fort to fort, searching for his betrayer, and finally, in June 1824, Hugh Glass walked into Fort Atkinson and finds Fitzgerald. Hugh draws his gun and walks into the fort, but is stopped by a U.S. Army captain. Hugh demands a face-to-face meeting with Fitzgerald so he can give him what he has coming to him, but his long-awaited revenge was immediately crushed. The captain informed Hugh that Fitzgerald had enlisted in the U.S. Army and was now government property. He would not allow Hugh to harm him. Glass pours out his story about how he was abandoned and left for dead by Fitzgerald, And the captain understands how that probably was pretty infuriating, so he tells Hugh to wait a moment. He returns with Hugh's rifle that Fitzgerald had taken and $300. Happy to have his rifle back, but still bummed he couldn't get his revenge, Hugh shouts a warning to Fitzgerald, who remained in hiding. "Never leave the army! Because if you do, you'll be dead." Hugh Glass then turns and leaves the fort, returning to life as a fur trapper, which he does for another 10 years, until the Arikara finally killed him. Bro really should have retired. The HMS Endurance. It's December 5th, 1914, and Sir Ernest Shackleton is sailing toward Antarctica aboard the HMS Endurance with a crew of 27 men. The early 20th century was the golden age of Antarctic exploration, and Shackleton was one of the greatest heroes of the era. In a previous expedition, he had come within just 97 nautical miles from becoming the first man to reach the South Pole, but he was forced to turn back when he ran out of supplies. Before he could attempt it again, Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen beat him to the prize, which was super frustrating. Now 40 years old, Shackleton knew time was running out on his career as an explorer. If he wanted to secure his place in history, he would need to achieve something even greater than reaching the South Pole. And that was exactly what this expedition aimed to do. Shackleton planned to be the first man to walk across the entire Antarctic continent, passing through the South Pole. This would probably take an entire Antarctic summer. His team would need to be perfect, but Shackleton was confident they could make history by accomplishing the impossible. But as the Endurance entered the Weddell Sea, Shackleton and his crew could see that something was not right. This should have been the peak of the Antarctic summer. Yet due to unusual weather that year, the sea was choked with ice. As the Endurance pushed closer towards the continent, the ice grew thicker and more threatening, and by January, the ship was completely frozen in place. Shackleton's crew tried desperately to chip away the ice and free the Endurance, but it was hopeless. Soon the brief summer season had passed, and without any other option, they were forced to wait until the ice would break during the next spring. For 8 brutal months, the crew survived on the ship, enduring the savage Antarctic winter. Shackleton worked tirelessly to maintain his men's morale, organizing games and sing-alongs, but in his private journal, he confessed his deepest fears about their situation. His only goal now was getting his men back home alive. In September 1915, the ice around the Endurance began to melt. The crew initially celebrated, thinking they were finally free. They had no idea their nightmare was about to become so much worse. As the ice melted, massive chunks began pressing against the ship. As the pressure from the ice sheets grew worse, the damage became so bad that by October 24th, water was pouring into the cabin. Shackleton gave the order to abandon ship, and the crew frantically unloaded supplies onto the ice sheet before watching the Endurance disappear beneath the surface forever. Shackleton hoped the ice sheet would drift them close enough to an island where he had cached supplies, but as the Antarctic summer progressed, the ice literally melted beneath their feet. Food grew scarce, and eventually, the sled dogs were shot to provide meat for the starving crew. Shackleton led desperate marches across the shifting ice floe, trying to reach solid land, but every attempt failed. They had to establish new camps while the ice was rapidly disintegrating beneath them. On the evening of April 8th, the ice sheet the crew was camped on suddenly began to split apart. Shackleton immediately ordered his crew to load the 3 remaining lifeboats from the Endurance and set off as their previous campsite crumbled apart. As they sailed through the night, one boat was lost in the darkness, crushing the spirits of the survivors. Shackleton had initially planned to head for Deception Island, but it proved deceptively difficult to reach. With his crew freezing in -20 Fahrenheit temperatures, he was instead forced to land on the barren wasteland of Elephant Island. As the men from the 2 surviving lifeboats unloaded their meager supplies, they spotted something miraculous on the horizon. The 3rd lifeboat had somehow found them. The crew reunited in tearful celebration, but reality soon set in. Elephant Island was a frozen hell. No whaling ships visited this desolate rock, and it had virtually no wildlife to sustain them. If they remained here, it would mean a slow, cold death for everyone. These men had trusted Shackleton with their lives, so he decided to risk his own to save them. He ordered his carpenter to repair and modify one of the lifeboats, the James Caird, which he and 5 others would use to attempt an 800-mile journey to South Georgia Island. He selected navigator Frank Worsley to join him, and he would assign him the near impossible job of guiding their tiny boat across some of the most dangerous waters on Earth, using only a map and a sextant. Shackleton packed enough food for 4 weeks, assuming that if they hadn't found land by then, they would have overshot their target and would be doomed anyway. The 6-man crew launched from Elephant Island on April 24th, putting their lives entirely in Frank Worsley's hands. For 14 hellish days, the James Caird was battered by 20-foot waves while ice formed on the boat and crew. Worsley navigated from memory and the few precious hours of daylight each morning provided. Finally, on May 8th, South Georgia Island appeared through the mists like a mirage. The tiny boat made landfall 2 days later. Against all odds, Worsley had successfully guided them to their destination. Though they had made it to the island, the 6 men were far from rescued. The James Caird had landed on the south side of the island, while the whaling stations Shackleton desperately needed were on the opposite side. He could either try sailing around the island, risking being blown off course, or attempt something that had never been done, climbing over the glacial mountains that stood between him and civilization. Shackleton chose Worsley and another sailor to accompany him on his final gamble. With no map to guide them, they set out at 2 a.m. on May 19, 1916, and began up the mountain. By dawn, they had climbed to 3,000 feet and could see the whaling station in the distance, but they were heartbroken to discover they were traveling in the wrong direction. They had to backtrack and continue through the night in complete darkness. By the next morning, they could make out the whaling station far below, and at 7 a.m., they heard a steam whistle, the first human sound they had heard in 2 years that wasn't their own. On the morning of May 20th, 3 skeletal figures with matted hair and wild beards stumbled into the Stromness whaling station. The whalers didn't believe the man claiming to be Ernest Shackleton. He had disappeared 2 years ago and was presumed dead. Only when Shackleton called the station manager he had met prior to the voyage by name did they finally believe him. Shackleton immediately convinced the whalers to help him rescue his men. The very next day, the 3 crew members from the James Caird, who were stranded on the other side of South Georgia, were rescued by a whaling boat guided by Shackleton himself. 3 days later, Shackleton set off in a whaling ship to rescue the rest of his men on Elephant Island. But winter was setting in, and the island was surrounded by an impenetrable ice pack. Shackleton desperately attempted to reach Elephant Island in July, but the ice was still too thick, and an August attempt also failed. 3 months had passed since Shackleton had left his men on that frozen rock, and he begged the Chilean Navy for assistance. They provided him with a steam tug that finally broke through to Elephant Island on August 30th. As the fog lifted around the ship's approach, Shackleton wondered if anyone could still be alive. He had left them in such a horrible place. But soon, he was overwhelmed with relief as he saw his men waving at him from the shore. They had survived, every single one of them, and within an hour, they were all aboard the rescue vessel. Against all odds, every member of Shackleton's crew from the HMS Endurance had survived 2 years in the most hostile environment on Earth. When Shackleton planned another Antarctic expedition in 1922, many men from the crew of the Endurance volunteered to join their captain on another adventure. Tragically, just before this new adventure could begin, Shackleton died of a heart attack on South Georgia Island, the very same island where he had risked everything to save his crew just 6 years earlier.
It's the year 1095, and things have been going horribly wrong for Pope Urban II. A few decades earlier, the once unified Christian church had fractured into 2 churches, with the Catholic Church in the west and the Orthodox Church in the east. This split, known as the Great Schism, had instantly cut the Pope's authority over all Christians in half. In Europe, where he was still the Christian commander-in-chief, his followers were not getting along and were instead busy going to war with each other. And if that wasn't bad enough, Muslim empires like the Seljuk Turks have been conquering Christian lands throughout the Middle East and had even taken control of the Holy Lands and Jerusalem itself. But out of the blue, messengers from Constantinople arrived with a request from Alexios Komnenos, the emperor of the Byzantine Empire. In his letter, he requests the aid of his Christian brothers to beat back the Muslim invaders who have been encroaching on his lands. And in this plea for help, Pope Urban sees an opportunity to solve all of his problems at once. So in November of 1095, he calls together the most influential people in Europe and holds the Council of Clermont. In front of this crowd, he gives a speech so epic it unites all of Europe for the first time in over a century.
The soldiers of Christ will march east and take back the Holy Land for their Lord and free their Christian brothers from the tyranny of Islam once and for all. This crusade, yes, I like that name, is totally just about that, and definitely not about exerting dominance over the Eastern Orthodox Church. Oh, and by the way, if you go and fight, God will forgive all your sins and stuff, and you get to go to heaven for free. The crowd erupts into cheers. Deus Vult, they begin to chant. It is the will of God. And with that, the age of the Crusades has begun. But just one problem. See, sometimes getting people this fired up can sometimes make people take action without fully thinking things through. So, unsurprisingly, some of the Crusades went horribly wrong. Like this one, for example. Number 1, the People's Crusade. So, there's this guy in France, Peter the Hermit, who gets wind of Pope Urban's epic speech and he's fired up. He starts riding around France on his donkey doing his best Pope Urban impression, giving speeches and sermons about taking back the Holy Land. He has an everyman appeal, and before you know it, he's managed to assemble an army of 40,000 followers. But there's just one problem. Peter's army was made up of almost exclusively peasants. We're talking men, women, children, old people who had never left their village. Combat experience? Just a few low-level knights amongst them. Supplies? Pfft, who needs that? Deus Vult, it's God's will! So in April of 1096, Peter's mob of holy hobos starts marching east, months before the official start date of the Crusades. They make it to Rhineland, an area in modern-day Germany, and surprise, surprise, they run out of food and they get hungry. And this is where things start to get a little out of hand. This hungry mob, still whipped up into a religious fervor by Peter the Hermit, sets their sights on the only non-Christians in the area, the Jews, and begins slaughtering them and looting their homes. Local Catholic bishops in the area try their best to hide and protect the fleeing Jews, but by the time Peter's mob had passed, casualties were in the thousands. Now, apparently, looting is one of those things that once you get a taste of it, it's really hard to stop. So the People's Crusade goes on to pillage every town and village they encounter on their way to Constantinople. They pass through Hungary, no pun intended, and with no Jews or Muslims in the area, they go ahead and start pillaging Christian towns instead. The mob makes their way into the Balkans, now officially in the Eastern Roman Empire, the land they came to defend from those evil Muslims. And they're looting again. First, they arrive at the city of Belgrade, which refused to let them enter, so they began pillaging the towns around the walls. They went on to sack the provincial capital of Niš. The plunderous pilgrims make it all the way to the walls of Constantinople, and Emperor Alexios looks out at this dirty mob of hungry and angry peasants. He's like, this is the help the Pope sent. Oh great, now they're looting my towns. And so the mob begins raiding towns around Constantinople, and Alexios has to send out his army to deal with these peasants who were only there because he requested help from the Pope in the first place. He quickly makes arrangements to get this mob out of his lands and helps Peter and his army get across the Bosphorus Strait. Finally, they're gonna get to go head-to-head against those Muslims. But there's just one small issue. Many of the villages and townspeople on this side of the Bosphorus were still technically Roman and actually still Christian. You know, the ones the Crusaders were supposed to be coming to protect. But the mob didn't seem bothered by that technicality and continue to raid and steal from these towns as well. They make it to a city called Nicomedia, located at the edge of the empire, and this unruly mob of peasants, against all odds, miraculously find themselves within striking distance of Nicaea, the city that hosted the Council of Nicaea, birthplace of modern Christianity itself. Peter tells his followers that they should wait here for the rest of the crusade to meet up before going any further, and his mob did not like that one bit. They want to go now. Peter realizes he's lost all control of his mob and heads back to Constantinople to get supplies. Spoiler alert, he never comes back. The group then splits in two factions who get into sort of a pissing contest to see which group is better at pillaging. Now, the Turkish Sultan's getting tired of this mob in his territory causing all these problems, so he sends out his professionally trained army, and unsurprisingly, against a mob of dumb peasants, they easily catch one of the groups who were out raiding and kill everyone who doesn't convert to Islam. They then send a message back to the remaining Crusaders that the group they just took out actually managed to take control of Nicaea.
Holy shit, they got Nicaea? Are you fucking kidding me? We can't let those idiots take all the good stuff.
And so the remaining 20,000 peasant crusaders go rushing off to get their share of the loot without a second thought. They follow the road into a narrow wooded valley, chanting rally cries and shouting like they're going to watch their team play in the Super Bowl or something. But unbeknownst to the Crusaders, the entire Turkish army had been waiting in the darkness for their arrival. When the entire mob had entered the valley, the Turkish soldiers ambushed them and slaughtered almost every single one of them. The 3,000 or so that made it out hole up in a fort until the real Crusaders come and rescue them. Now, this People's Crusade, though a complete shit show, did have real-world effects for the first official crusade. See, the Sultan assumed that this mob of peasants were the best Europe had to offer, and he seriously underestimated the real First Crusade when they reached his land. In fact, the shit show that was the Peasants' Crusade is probably one of the biggest reasons the First Crusade went on to be the most successful crusade of them all. But that doesn't mean it wasn't without its own fucked up parts, like this one for instance. Number 2. The Siege of Mara. Okay, so now we're in the first real crusade, and the Holy Army from Europe has steamrolled its way well into Turkish territory. These guys are actually real knights and soldiers this time, so they've been much more successful than Peter's mob, and in just 2 years have reclaimed a large portion of former Christian territory. However, in 1098, they arrive at the city of Antioch, and this one, for some reason, is way harder to conquer than the ones they've conquered so far. The siege goes on for months, and the Crusaders use up all of their supplies in the process. Now starving outside the city walls, they're eating anything and everything they can find. Their horses, donkeys, dogs, cats, rats, tree bark, even the leather from their armor and shoes. But even that quickly runs out, and many begin to starve to death. After 8 months, they finally bribe a defender within the city, and the Crusaders rush in, driven mad by hunger and the resentment of months of resistance, and they begin ruthlessly slaughtering thousands of townspeople. But after the dust settles and they begin to search for food, they find that the city is barren. What little they find is nowhere near enough to feed them all. Before they even have a chance to come up with their next idea, a massive Turkish relief army arrives and traps the Crusaders inside the city. The men inside realize that this is probably the end of their journey. They're exhausted and literally starving to death. But miraculously, a monk amongst their ranks is guided by a vision to a spot in the floor of the Cathedral of St. Peter. He begins to dig there and finds what he instantly recognizes as the Holy Lance, the very spear that was thrust into Jesus when he was on the cross. He holds it up for the Crusaders to see, and they take it as a sign from God and are re-energized by their faith. Though massively outnumbered, they storm out of the city walls, taking the Turks by surprise, and with the last bits of strength, defeat the army outside the city. But while they can now move on from Antioch, the victory did nothing to fix their food situation. So the Crusaders travel to a port town called Mara, thinking a trading port should have all the food they need to continue their quest. Now fueled only by primitive instincts to survive, the Crusaders construct an enormous siege tower and begin a deadly siege on the city. The Muslim defenders put up a heavy resistance, but the Crusaders make their way into the city in December, and now, having lost their humanity to starvation, begin massacring everyone there. They begin searching for food, but they're horrified to discover that the townspeople of Mara were also starving. The city had no food at all. It's at this point, driven mad by hunger, the Crusaders do the unthinkable. They look to the slain Muslim townpeople. Their bodies, like the Crusaders, were also reduced to skin and bones. An ultra-religious group called the Tarfurs then begin explaining to everyone that they're all here to do God's bidding, and eating non-Christian flesh is technically still a win for their God because, less non-Christians equal more Christians. And so they begin to savagely rip off the clothing from the dead and begin to slice chunks of flesh from the buttocks of the deceased. They then quickly began roasting the human flesh over a fire, with some reportedly so hungry that they couldn't wait for the meat to be cooked all the way through before devouring it like wild animals. Word spread through the Turkish Empire about the warriors from the west who eat humans, and Muslim cities start surrendering left and right. Nobody wants to be the next item on the menu, and the Crusaders manage to take back Jerusalem, but at the cost of, becoming cannibals in the process. Number 3, the Fourth Crusade. So, it's been over a century of crusading shenanigans. The Christians managed to get a hold of Jerusalem for a while, which was huge considering Muslims had controlled it for over 450 years, only to lose it back during the Third Crusade. So in 1202, Pope Innocent III is all, "Hey, it was pretty sweet when we had Jerusalem back, let's go get it again." But walking across Europe takes forever, so they come up with a better plan. get an army together, sail to Egypt, the Muslim powerhouse, knock them out first, then march to Jerusalem. But first, the Crusaders need to figure out a way to sail there. So they travel to Venice and make a deal with the Doge, a guy named Enrico Dandolo, to provide ships for their army. And this single act changes the course of human history as we know it. See, decades ago, Dandolo was just a regular Venetian trader, and on a business trip to Constantinople, he gets into a heated argument with some Byzantine traders. During the argument, someone clubs him in the head so hard that he goes blind. Though he's able to continue his business and eventually becomes the top dog in Venice, he's never able to see again. And because of this, he never forgives the Byzantines for the rest of his life. So Dandolo, who's like 90 years old now, gets a message from the Crusaders about needing ships, and he agrees to build them this massive fleet. We're talking 50 warships and enough transport ships for 33,500 men. The price tag? 85,000 silver marks, about $750 million in today's money. It's a lot, but the Crusaders run some numbers and figure out that if everyone who's supposed to come chips in, they'll be able to afford the ships. One tiny problem though. Only about 12,000 Crusaders actually show up. The Crusaders can't pay, and this is music to Dandolo's ears. He knows from his years in business that there's no better way to control humans than debt. If he plays his cards right, he essentially gets to control this giant army and can make them do whatever he wants. The Crusaders really need these ships, so they ask if there's any other way they can pay for them. And upon hearing this, Dandolo smiles and suggests to the Crusaders that they make a quick stop to visit his old friends at Constantinople.
You know, this is a pretty rich city. You could probably find some money to pay for these ships there, if you know what I mean. Oh, okay. Can we use your ships to get there?
No. So the Crusaders find this other guy with ships named Alexios Angelos, who said he can help them get there. Just one condition though. He's like,
help me become Byzantine emperor and I'll pay your debt, give you supplies, and send troops to Jerusalem.
See, his dad, Isaac Angelos, was actually the Byzantine emperor just a few short years ago, but was blinded and deposed by his brother for some reason. He was probably a huge asshole. So Alexios wants to reclaim what he thinks is his birthright. The Crusaders shrug and say, "F it," and sail to Constantinople, the largest Christian city in the world, the very city that started the Crusades in the first place, and sack it. They put Alexios on the throne, but after the deed's done and the Crusaders ask for their payment, surprise, he can't pay up either. The Byzantines, not really happy with their new emperor, are like,
"Boo, Alexios sucks. Just like his dad."
And they strangle him to death. Riots erupt, and the Crusaders, seeing the chaos they accidentally caused, decide,
you know what? Screw it. Let's just take Constantinople for ourselves.
And so they do. In April 1204, they breach the walls of the city again and absolutely wreck the place. We're talking about 2,000 civilians killed, churches stripped bare, and ancient holy relics treated like yard sale merchandise. The Crusaders end up dividing the Byzantine Empire, creating this thing called the Latin Empire. Venice gets the best trade ports, giving Dandolo the revenge he was looking for, and various Crusader lords get to play emperor and king in lands they barely understand. Though the Byzantine Empire is eventually re-established about 50 years later, it never fully recovers, making it way easier for the Ottoman Turks to eventually take over, and the split between Catholic and Orthodox Christians becomes basically permanent. So yeah, basically the Fourth Crusade ended with Crusaders destroying the largest Christian city in the East and overthrowing the very empire that requested their help. They never even got close to Jerusalem. Number 4, the Children's Crusade. In 1212, shortly after the Fourth Crusade, where the Crusaders wrecked Constantinople, a 12-year-old shepherd boy named Stephen in France is handed a letter from Jesus himself. Or at least that's what he tells everyone. According to Stephen, Jesus picked him to lead an army of children to take back Jerusalem. Jesus told him children can't be damned for murder and pillaging since they're too young to commit actual sins. What a loophole! Now, Stephen can't read. Actually, nobody can read in 1212 except monks and nobles, but that doesn't stop him from telling everyone that this is what the letter says, and that God wants all you kids to get out there and show the adults how a crusade is really done. Stephen's actually really good at public speaking, and thousands join him, mostly kids and teenagers, but he actually gets some adults to join his crusade as well. Stephen brings his followers to Paris to tell King Philip II that he and his followers are ready for their crusade. And the king's like,
yeah, you kids should go home.
But Stephen's crew is fired up, and they ignore the king's orders and begin their march across Europe towards the Middle East. Now, God works in mysterious ways, and at the exact same time in Germany, this other kid, Nicholas, who's also received a message from God, is doing exactly the same thing. And he also manages to convince another 20,000 kids to follow him, and they begin their own journey towards Jerusalem. Nicholas decides that the shortest route to their goal is a march across the Alps. But remember, these are kids organizing this, so they don't think about the details, and soon find themselves walking through the Alps in summer clothes with no food or supplies. They're basically in flip-flops in negative 20-degree weather, so yeah, lots of them die. The survivors reach the city of Genoa, and this was Nicholas's big moment. He turns to his exhausted followers and tells them that God himself told him he would part the Mediterranean Sea just like he did the Red Sea for Moses. Nicholas and his followers wade out into the water with conviction and wait for their sign from God. And nothing happened. With no miracle, Nicholas and his group gave up their crusade and started the journey home. And unsurprisingly, even more kids die on the way back through the Alps. Somehow Nicholas survives his crusade and gets home to Cologne, but when he shows up with just a handful of the 20,000 kids he left with, the parents of these kids who didn't make it are pissed they were fooled by this brat and end up hanging Nicholas for revenge. As for Stephen, somewhere along their journey, his group ran into some merchants who offered them free rides to Jerusalem. Turns out these were the wrong kind of merchants, and Stephen and his crew quickly became their inventory, and they were reportedly all sold into slavery. Now, surprisingly, the failed children's crusades actually had a pretty huge impact on Pope Innocent III. He watched these kids, equipped with literally nothing but faith alone, make it all the way to Genoa, and he uses the story to inspire the soldiers of the Fifth Crusade. Because honestly, getting to Genoa without, conquering or pillaging a major Christian city was pretty good compared to some of the earlier crusades.